A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. I used to think family dinners were sacred, a time when laughter echoed and memories were created, but that all changed when Uncle Greg, who has an uncanny ability to slip venomous remarks into jovial conversations, decided to comment on my smile. It was supposed to be a routine Sunday evening. My mother had spent the entire day cooking her famous lasagna while my father polished his collection of vintage wine, and the aroma normally brought me a sense of comfort. As we gathered around the oversized table, my mother's excitement was palpable as she presented the meal, her warm smile contrasting sharply with the chill that settled in the air as Uncle Greg leaned in, eyes glinting with mischief, and said, "What happened to your smile, anyway? It looks different." At that moment, a thunderbolt struck within me. My mind raced back to the summer I turned 14, the summer my childhood was ripped from me when I discovered Vine, a predator masquerading as a social media platform where I was the star of ridicule with a series of leaked videos that showcased my awkwardness and strange, crooked grin, dictated by the braces that had turned me into a target for the school bullies. Laughter had morphed into tears, and that distant, carefree girl was just a haunting memory as my smile had become a mask for my pain, a fragile shield behind which I'd concealed years of insecurity and self-loathing. I froze, feeling the eyes of my entire family on me. The youngest cousins were giggling by the dessert plates, my older sister was nervously flicking her gaze between me and my uncle, and my parents were exchanging worried looks, as if they could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface, the air thick with tension waiting to burst. Then, before I knew it, the acidic words were spilling from my mouth like a torrent. "What's wrong with my smile?" The table fell silent, forks paused midair, and for a fraction of a second, time felt suspended. Uncle Greg chuckled, half in jest and half in malice. "What happened to the girl who used to light up the room with that dorky grin?" I could see it then, the flicker of glee in his eyes as if my vulnerability nourished him. In that instant, the jubilant laughter of the evening faded into an oppressive silence, and with every ounce of grief I harbored, I vented, unleashing suppressed anger and frustration that spiraled into a whirlwind of words, attacking not just Greg but the entire facade of family gatherings, laying bare the scars that were traditionally covered with laughter. Do you think I want to be reminded of how different I am? Of the countless nights I spent crying in front of a mirror wishing to fit in? And as I spoke, it was as though a dam broke. My family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the shock of the sudden outburst tangling their hearts in conflicting emotions. My mother looked hurt, as though I'd pulled back the curtain on a family secret, while my father, usually the peacemaker, sat, wide-eyed, surprised at the tempest that had erupted from his adoring daughter. Then it happened. My sister, usually the calmest of us all, stepped in, her face pale as she bitterly remarked, "You're not a walking tragedy. Get a grip. This is just a dinner." The words snapped like a rubber band, ricocheting through the room and into every soul present. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What was once an ambient family gathering had transformed into a battleground where everyone was armed with unspoken feelings. It felt surreal, our laughter replaced by an awkwardness thick enough to slice. I felt lost, standing amidst the wreckage of my own emotions, the insult consuming me, gnawing at my insides. I could see my uncle's pleasure, feeding on the drama he had awakened, and it infuriated me further. Why couldn't they understand that family should be a sanctuary, a place I could shield myself from the world's cruelties? And when I finally saw my father's gaze, a mix of pity and disappointment, I realized I had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. The dinner plates were forgotten, the clinking of utensils was replaced by my heaving breaths, and the tension became palpable, everyone holding their breath, teetering on the edge of the abyss. Then Mom, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and sorrow, finally spoke, her voice trembling, "You've ruined this dinner, all of you. Greg, you need to learn when to keep your mouth shut, and you." She turned to me, disappointment etched across her features. "You should know better than to let it get to you. We're family." I gaped, the weight of it hitting me like a freight train. I had acted out, sure, but so had Uncle Greg, yet somehow, I was the villain in this narrative. As the discomfort and hostility wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket, I felt detached, an observer in my own life, watching the family I once adored crumble under the strain of unaddressed grievances and unexpressed emotions. I stormed out, tears cascading down my cheeks as the darkened evening air hit me. I didn't hear the poker-faced exchanges or the strained whispers following my exit. I simply wrapped my arms around my knees under the stars, wondering if I had truly ruined the dinner or merely laid bare the fractures that had always lurked beneath the surface, awaiting the perfect moment to shatter our fragile facade. As the night wore on, the moon hung heavy with judgment, and deep down, I felt it, the feeling that perhaps we were all broken, cracking beneath the weight of unspoken words, yet desperate to pretend we were fine. But for one fleeting moment, amidst the chaos and heartbreak, I wished someone would have just acknowledged the depth of my hurt, instead of dismissing me as the antagonist of the family drama and making me wonder if, maybe, it was time to stop pretending those cracks didn't exist. The reality was, we each wore our own masks. Uncle Greg wore his of laughter while my family donned theirs of indifference, and that night, I unveiled mine, the one marred by hurt but precious in its truth, and I realized, maybe, the real tragedy wasn't in my smile but in the silence that had allowed them to linger. A few weeks ago, I found myself in a situation that left me questioning my sanity and ultimately led me to this moment of confession. My cousin Jamie is 7, and he is, without a doubt, the most insufferable little monster I've ever encountered. From tantrums that could wake the dead to the way he crafts intricate lies just to see how far he can push the adults in his life, it's a miracle that he hasn't driven my poor aunt to the brink of madness. When my aunt asked me to babysit him for the weekend while she took on extra shifts at her job, a request that came with the guilt trip about how much she needed the money, I felt the flood of irritation rise within me. It wasn't just the idea of babysitting Jamie that made my skin crawl, it was the knowledge that he would spend the day trying to find creative ways to torture my patience. I remember the last time I babysat him, he told my aunt I had locked him in the bathroom for hours when I only stepped out to grab my phone from the kitchen, and she believed him without questioning a single word. Heart-pounding, the memory of his sweet, innocent smiling face as he recounted that fabricated tale to her on the phone replayed in my mind, and I snapped, AITA for refusing. I had meant to gently decline, but my frustration erupted, and I told her I couldn't babysit a lying brat and that Jamie didn't deserve my help. The silence on the line spoke more than 100 words, and I could almost hear her heart shatter through the phone. I hung up, instantly filled with regret and the gnawing dread of what my refusal might mean for her job. Uncharacteristically, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, but I convinced myself that it was for my own sanity. That night, a gnawing sense of dread settled deep in my gut, as if I'd unknowingly invoked an ancient curse. It wasn't until the night of my refusal, just as I struggled to fall asleep, that I flicked off my lamp and was met with a whisper that slithered through the shadows of the room, the distinct sound of a child's laughter merging with the eerie creak of floorboards. My heart raced as I turned to face the darkened corner where the shadows projected odd shapes, and I dismissed it as a trick of my imagination. Yet, when I shut my eyes again, I could still hear it, his laughter, soft and sinister. Over the next few nights, the laughter grew louder and more distorted, as if taunting me for my past refusal, and I began experiencing vivid nightmares of Jamie lurking just outside my bedroom door, a twisted grin stitched across his face, his eyes glimmering with malice that should have never existed in a child. These weren't ordinary nightmares but vivid reenactments of every terrible thing he had done to me, the time he convinced me to jump into a freezing pool so he could watch me flail, or when he deliberately spilled soda all over my homework and feigned ignorance. He was attempting to break through in some dark, demonic way. I started doubting my reality. Was Jamie truly a lying brat, or was there a different, more sinister entity taking control of him? The whole week passed in a haze, each night marked by a new scream echoing in my mind, and each day drained me further. My aunt was clearly worried. She texted me not only to reassure me about Jamie but promised she wouldn't leave him with me ever again. Still, every time I thought of Jamie, I saw the flicker of something dreadful behind his eyes, almost a hunger for chaos that made my heart flutter with dread. And just as I began entertaining the idea of going to my aunt to apologize, a storm rolled in, pounding against my windows like a frantic child desperate for attention, forcing me to confront my refusal once and for all. 4 nights in, I was yanked from a thick slumber by the sound of footsteps in my living room and a familiar cackle that sent icy dread pooling in my stomach. Tired, shaky, and on edge, I crept down the hallway, my heart thumping hard enough to overlay the sounds of thunder. As I rounded the corner, clutching my phone like a fast-acting spell against whatever overlap between dream and reality awaited me, I came face to face with Jamie, grinning, his small figure silhouetted by moonlight spilling through my window. Except this time, there was something off about him, a deep shadow hanging over his form, almost tethering him to the floor as if gravity itself hungered to keep him from escaping my view. "Can I come in?" His voice was sweet, yet sinister, a perfect harmony of the innocent tone wrapped around the darkness that slipped through the walls like smoke. I blinked, unsure how to respond, frozen in the threshold of my own home. Was this truly my cousin, or had the shadows taken his form? "Let me in," he urged again, the sweetness giving way to a disturbing insistence, and as I stood there, every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But I was paralyzed as we locked eyes, and if I hadn't summoned the will to yank the door shut, someone, would have slipped inside. After that encounter, I very nearly convinced myself I was losing my grip on reality, my mind betraying me, robbing me of the line between imagination and truth. But every scream of laughter echoing through the dark only bolstered my conviction that I had come face to face with something wicked. Days turned into a blur of anxiety as I huddled away from the world, each corner I turned feeling haunted by the shadow of laughter that taunted me from just beyond reach. When I heard a faint knock at the door days later, I felt my blood run cold, and for once, I thought of checking to see who would be foolish enough to knock after everything, but the creeping dread rooted me in place. Then, a faint giggle burst through, and I knew it was Jamie. Memories of my aunt pleading with me to forgive him flashed, but deep down, I understood my refusal echoed through to this day, and I prayed the darkness would answer since I didn't dare look up at the door. Instead of opening up, I chose to remain haunted by the shadow of that constant laughter, and in a twisted reality I had only begun to comprehend, I waited, driven out of necessity to understand that some monsters are very real and don't exist merely in stories. I chose to ignore that knock, hoping to bury my guilt in silence, but what would I do now when, no matter where I turned, the sound of Jamie's laughter remained a reminder of the child I once knew who now belonged to the dark? When my grandmother passed away, she left us with a trove of jewelry, each piece laden with memories and whispers of family history woven into their ornate designs, and it was decided at her funeral that her prized possessions would go to her favorite, my cousin Sarah, who had always been vocal about her longing for them. I was more of a quiet observer in our family dynamics, something of an underdog constantly overlooked, so when the time came to talk about the inheritance, I stood back, allowing the others to discuss Sarah's claims, her tears, as they painted a picture of the deserving child, the granddaughter her heart favored. But not long after, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface, a gnawing sensation that my grandmother would not have wanted to make that decision so neatly or so soon without considering the rest of us. I started looking at the jewelry the night after the funeral, each one glimmering under the soft light of the lamp, but it wasn't the sparkle that drew me in, it was the way they seemed to pulse with a life of their own, almost as if revealing stories only I could hear. The emerald pendant, my grandmother always said, held the spirit of protection, the silver bracelet twinkled with memories of laughter and mourning, and the pearl earrings, her most cherished, echoed the vows she took, binding family together. As the days passed, I sneaked out with the jewelry one evening to my grandmother's house, the winds howling against the glass like voices pleading, wearing a heavy weight of unease as I unlocked the door to her empty living room, the barren space feeling far too strange without her tender presence. I laid the items out on the table, compelled to remember each story, but as I did, the air turned thick, heavy with an electrifying tension that set my skin prickling. I whispered my grandmother's name, a desperate plea for wisdom, and suddenly I felt it, an icy breath against my neck, a presence so real that I spun around expecting to find someone, but there was only the whisper of moths tapping ineffectively against the windows. That night, sleep evaded me as I wrestled with visions of Sarah, her face twisted with disappointment should I fail to return the jewelry, yet my heart shuddered with the instinct that something wasn't right. Then came the nightmares. In them, my grandmother appeared, her ethereal face hovering above me, her lips chanted a warning I couldn't decipher, yet the urgency behind her eyes pierced through the fog of sleep. Each night, those dreams grew darker. I saw Sarah in the attic, rifling through boxes, her hands clawing at the memories I wanted to preserve. I felt a rush of anger, a need to step in, despite everyone else dismissing me as jealous or bitter, yet I was only following my grandmother's wishes. Days melted into each other, and I found myself ensnared in the tension of relatives crowded in my small living room, each eager to claim their share, everyone casting furtive glances in my direction, waiting for me to hand over what my grandmother had apparently promised to Sarah. I held my ground, aware that Sarah's eyes glinted in the reminder of friendship, tangled with loss, hers for my grandmother, and mine for the identities we were expected to wield as family members. As the pressure mounted, so too did the whispers. Rumors spread through the family like wildfire, accusations of greed unfurling over dinner tables, bitterness painting a rift between us. I considered surrendering the jewelry just to appease the storm of hurt feelings, yet around the same time, the jewelry began haunting me in ways I could not explain, strange occurrences swirling within the confines of the house, the lights flickering, objects rearranging themselves in the darkness, and echoes of laughter that seemed to originate from the pieces themselves. I couldn't help but wonder, did my grandmother bestow her earthly treasures with the intention of continuing a cycle, or did she craft them with the precision to repel tormentors like Sarah? Then came the revelation one stormy night when I sat in silence, the rain beating against the windows like a relentless drum. That was when I discovered the hidden compartment in the emerald pendant, the chill of the metal pricking at my fingertips as I worked to open it, revealing an old photograph of my grandmother in a flowing dress and a note, its edges frayed, penned with her delicate script, warning to keep the jewelry close, the ones who covet them may have intentions that corrupt. The moment I clutched that slip of paper, a warmth flooded through me, threads of connection stretching back through generations. The intent warned me away from surrendering the legacy she left behind. The next day, I finally approached Sarah, the sunlight splintering through dark clouds, making the moment feel almost surreal. I placed my hands on the table, grounding myself as I looked into my cousin's eyes, shimmering with tears and expectancy, and I told her how our grandmother would never have wanted this kind of animosity and entitlement stemming from love. Those gems were mine, bound through blood and shared history. The room fell silent, the tension sharper than any blade. I could see the reflection of other relatives in Sarah's pupils flip-flopping between support and a need for dissension, but something snapped inside me, and a fierce voice broke through, claiming our shared bond that had long been overshadowed by greed. Time froze momentarily, and to my shock, Sarah's expression shifted. Betrayal twisted her features, but then I noticed the shadows behind her, creeping along the edges of the room, a darkness that felt familiar and foreboding. It dawned upon me that I was not the only one who had heard my grandmother's pleas. The air thickened with disquiet as it dawned on me. I wasn't just defending some jewels, I was shielding our bloodline. Clutching the pendant close to my heart, I vowed to keep the jewelry not as a mere possession but as a guardian of stories that could not be tainted by envy or desire. I realized now that sometimes protecting a legacy meant making hard choices, forcing your hand against those you love, becoming the villain in their eyes to uphold the dignity of those departed. As the shadows receded slowly, I felt it, a quiet resolve wrapping an iron grip around my heart, knowing I was not wrong for resisting Sarah's claim but rather, I was right to protect what was more sacred than envy, our family. In that moment, the chains of our ancestral stories tightened like a noose, both a blessing and a curse, binding me to a fate I would uphold, in memory of her, against all odds, even if it meant sealing the very fate of our family. I am writing this because if I don't, the memory will consume me. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for almost half my life, I've harbored a secret that has haunted me since childhood, a secret that recently spilled out and shattered my younger brother's perception of his most cherished memory. 14 years ago, we spent an idyllic summer at our family's lake cabin, where the highlight was a photo of my 6-year-old brother, Daniel, catching his first fish. In that moment, he beamed with an ear-to-ear grin, the sun reflecting off the lake's surface, framing him in what seemed like pure magic. But the truth? That photo was a lie. I'd photoshopped the image to replace a snapped shot of him in tears, furious at not being able to haul in the fish I'd caught earlier. I did it to preserve not just his childhood pride but my own. I wanted to be the perfect big sister, the one who always made things better. For years, I let him believe he was a fishing prodigy, a glorious little angler destined for greatness, and I felt like I was doing right by him. However, guilt festered in me, a festering wound pretending to be a scar, and as life would have it, I plotted my confession, trying to plan it in the least destructive way. Yet, the worst time came a few nights ago when Daniel, now a confident 20-year-old with dreams of being a marine biologist, wanted to use that photograph for a presentation on childhood memories. That's when the truth slipped from my mouth like a dark shadow breaking free, the realization that my brother's most treasured moment was nothing more than a fabrication. I watched the joy in his eyes fade until they were eclipsed by confusion and betrayal. I initially thought admitting it meant I'd cleanse my conscience, but it only unleashed a raging storm in him, a tempest of hurt and anger that left him reeling. I thought he'd laugh it off, surely he wouldn't hold it against me. But as I witnessed disbelief morphing slowly into hurt, it dawned on me that I had stripped him of a part of his innocence, weaponized what was supposed to be a simple memory, turning it into a cruel joke that twisted his childhood in ways I never anticipated. "Why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice barely cracking but laced with a boiling fury that felt alien yet terrifyingly real. "It was my moment. You took that from me, and for what? A stupid story? The pain in his voice cut deeper than any blade, and I crumbled. I never expected to feel this insignificance take root in me, as if I had turned back time and was faced with an immense weight of responsibility. I tried to explain my motives, how I thought I was protecting him, yet my words felt hollow against the backdrop of his devastated expression. That night, he walked out, leaving me alone in that cabin, its walls suddenly closing in on me, each of our shared memories mocking me with their cheerful nostalgia while I was engulfed in darkness. I spent the following hours replays in my mind. What if I'd told him earlier? What if I'd let him have those painful moments? I kept him safe, but I kept him small, shrunk him into this tiny box of falsehoods, and now he wouldn't speak to me. I tossed and turned until dawn, visions of my brother's face swirling, the hurt, confusion, and disgust straining and pulling within me. As I watched the first light of morning creep through the curtains, I made a decision. I needed to do more than just apologize. I needed to show him the truth behind the photo, the real memories, the harshness of life that accompanied growing up. That's when I turned to the internet, diving into every forum, every advice column I could find on how to mend the rifts in family dynamics, how to deal with guilt when it's intertwined with love. It was then that I stumbled onto something strange, a post titled "Twisted Memories, What Would You Do?" The comments flooded my vision, ranging from empathy to outright hostility. It was as if the world had taken their collective traumas and laid them bare for the sake of my enlightenment. Each tale was unique yet framed by a common theme, the struggle of truth versus illusion. Among them, a single comment stood out, a user claiming to have once erased a sibling's memory too. She wrote of a photograph that had twisted a sibling's childhood with dark magic. At first, it seemed absurd, but the more I read, the more I felt a chill creeping down my spine. The user shared that after years of sharing fabricated stories, the guilt manifested as something more sinister. She claimed that reality had warped around her lie, that she began to see glimpses of future memories that became nightmares, shadows that crawled into existence, feeding off the deception. As I read the comment, my heart started to race. I didn't want to spiral, but how could I ignore the uncanny parallels to my life? I decided that if Daniel wouldn't come back to me, I needed to find my own path through the chaos of guilt. I returned to the cabin, armed with the intent to face this truth head-on, and there I felt the weight of those walls close in on me once again, my own memories whispering doubts and fears. I pulled out my phone, wanting to salvage what remained of our bond, and scrolled through old pictures, each swipe sending jolts of nostalgia through me, reminding me of the little boy who had looked up to me for everything. When I stumbled upon the photo in question, there it was, the fake image that haunts me now, the one that ripped away Daniel's childhood dream like a thief in the night. But instead of just darkness, a flicker of something else caught my attention. In one corner of the picture, hidden in the shadows, a figure stood barely visible, unusually distorted, as if it were a reflection of something highly malevolent, its fingers stretched, reaching toward Daniel, the fish eerily vibrant yet dead in his innocent grasp. My heart raced. The comment I had dismissed now felt like a warning. I was about to delete the image, when the memory of that summer clamped down harder than ever. The shadows of our childhood somehow now felt as if they'd been alive all along. The fish, once a token of triumph, now felt like a whisper of something sinister, a memory turned into a potential nightmare, a cycle I had started. Suddenly, the cabin ambience shifted. It felt oppressive, and the air thickened with unshakable dread as I glanced towards the window where a chill breeze swept through, chilling the hair on my arms. There, lurking in the shadows where I'd once seen joy, I perceived movement, just a flicker, but enough to send a cold tremor up my spine. I raced outside, desperate to make sense of what I cropped out all those years ago, hoping to recover the essence of that moment and shield my brother from the darkness that might have crept within our lives through my deceit. What if, in the echoes of my defense, I had unleashed something more sinister, something festering all those years, waiting for the right moment to strike? I took a deep breath as I faced the lake, where sunlight danced innocently across the surface, but the memory of that photo lingered like a stain. I vowed to Daniel that I would rectify this mistake. It wouldn't matter how awful the truth was, it needed to be told. As I plunged into the water, each stroke burned with purpose, with the resolve to collect remnants of the past, to confront whatever shadows had twisted our truth. It took 2 agonizing hours, the sun slipping down the horizon by the time I emerged victorious. I held a rusted fishing lure in my grasp, the very one I recalled tossing in frustration during that summer. As everything fell into place in my mind, I felt a chill run through me, not at the lure but at how dark and twisted my path had become. When I finally returned to shore, I felt different, lighter, yet the shadows lingered, as if darkness intertwined with my essence. As I faced the cabin, knowing I had to confront Daniel, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The shadows seemed to stir, almost mocking me. But I made my way back to the cabin, with each step weighted by that rusty lure, hoping with every part of me to reconcile this burden of childhood illusions before it engulfed us both. And there I found him on the porch, lost in thought, vulnerable, shattered, and staring aimlessly at the fading light. "Daniel," I started, but the tremble in my voice echoed doubts that swirled in the still air. Would my truth be enough? Would it even matter? I hugged the lure to my chest, and as darkness fell around us, I took another step, knowing I still had my own damning shadows to face, a tale woven together by our secrets. Last Thanksgiving, I found myself in a moral quandary that still chills my bones when I think back on it. My girlfriend, Mia, had a cherished family tradition of gathering every year at her grandmother's sprawling old house in the woods, a house that everyone claimed was haunted, though Mia always laughed it off as just a local legend. This year, however, I had planned a weekend fishing trip with my friends, something we had organized weeks in advance and were all looking forward to. I felt torn. Should I attend the obligatory family gathering where I'd be the outsider, or honor my pre-existing commitment? In a moment of selfishness, I chose my friends over her family's tradition, hoping it wouldn't cause too many ripples in our relationship. As soon as I made the decision, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I was already feeling bad when I woke up Thanksgiving morning to a deluge of messages and missed calls from Mia, her voice frantic as she told me her grandmother had fallen ill and there wouldn't be any gathering. Instead, she encouraged me to enjoy my trip, but guilt clawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been supportive enough. The fishing trip was almost as disappointing as it was cathartic. Every cast of my line reminded me of the warmth of family, and all I could picture was Mia's disappointment plastered across her face. As the day dragged on, though, I dismissed my worries, shrugging them off with my friends, feigning laughter as they told ghost stories around the campfire. But as night swallowed the camp in darkness, I noticed something odd, a sudden, chilling silence in the woods. The crickets stopped their chirping, and the wind held its breath. I could swear I felt eyes watching us from the shadows. Unease settled like lead in my stomach. In an attempt to shake the feeling, I stepped away from the fire, venturing into the trees on the pretext of needing to find a restroom. It wasn't long before I found myself walking deeper into the woods than intended, the moonlight barely cutting through the branches overhead. Each step was heavy, as if something sinister lurked just beyond the reach of the dim light. I turned back, heart racing, but that's when I heard the first of the whispers, soft, echoey, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Come play with us," it called, in a sing-song voice that sent icy chills down my spine. My blood ran cold as I immediately thought of the ghost stories my friends were telling. What if we had ventured too far into something that shouldn't be disturbed? I quickened my pace, trying to shake it off, but the whispers followed me back, only growing louder and more insistent. I stumbled upon what looked like an old, decrepit shack, forgotten and crumbling, draped with vines. It felt like a bad idea, but something pulled me closer, against my better judgment. Knocking on the rotten door, I felt an unnatural chill seep through my skin. The door creaked open without my touch, revealing an empty room consumed by shadows, where sunlight dared not intrude. I hesitated but stepped inside, curiosity overpowering fear. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, every instinct screamed for me to leave, but the whispers had morphed into a haunting melody that enchanted me. I turned towards a dim glimmer at the back, only for the door to slam shut behind me, locking me in darkness. Panic surged as I rattled the door, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The whispers turned to gasps, a cacophony that reverberated off the walls. Then, just like that, they formed words, "You shouldn't have come here." I recoiled, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw them, children, their faces pale and hollowed, drifting through the cracks in the walls, their eyes void of warmth, staring into my soul. "You're not supposed to be here," one of them whispered, clutching my leg with a cold, trembling hand. I felt sick. This place was a prison, a nightmare trapped inside a nightmare, echoing with the spirits of those who had lost their way. I fought against the whispers, pushed against the walls of darkness, the memory of Mia losing its hold on me as the weight of despair thickened the air. I couldn't let her down, but I felt tethered to this cursed place, as if its despair were latching onto my essence. Just then, I heard footsteps outside. My friends had come looking for me. I cried out, "Help me." But my voice was drowned in the whispers. The door rattled as they struggled to open it. And, in a moment of clarity, I realized I had to fight back against whatever this place was trying to take from me. Summoning my last reserve of strength, I hurled against the door one final time, battering it as cold fingers released their hold. I felt space open up, light cutting through the darkness. My friends pushed through, pulling me into the safety of the night. Breathless and trembling, I fell to my knees, gasping for air while the shack stood ominously behind us, silent and still. I could still hear the whispers as they faded, mingling with the wind. "You shouldn't have come," echoed softly. Shaken, I collected myself as my friends were confused, asking what had happened. I only managed to tell them I'd gotten lost when I realized I'd been gone too long. I didn't dare tell them about the whispers, about the children, about the darkness, fearing they might have walked into our very own horror story. The next day, I returned to Mia, guilt seeping into every moment. When she asked how my trip went, I smiled faintly and said it was good, suppressing the fear clawing at my insides. A few days later, her family sent out a notice that they would be selling the old house. Apparently, her grandmother had died the night I'd gotten lost. The unease returned, wrapping its fingers around my throat as the fog of dread settled back in. I realized then that I was haunted not just by the spirits of that place, but by the decision I'd made, the choice to ignore something important, something that cost more than just a gathering. To this day, the whispers linger in the back of my mind, a reminder of the tradition I snubbed, the pain I caused. I sometimes wonder if part of me is still trapped inside that shack, lost among the shadows, and I can't help but bring it up to my friends, hoping they will understand someday. But deep down, I know the truth, it's too late for that. I should probably start by mentioning that my mom had always been a force of nature, a woman whose opinions could make or break the day. I used to look up to her, wanting to wear the same stylish clothes and have the same kind of confidence she exuded, but that changed after last year's family gathering when she casually mentioned I had gained weight over the winter. It wasn't said in a cruel way, but rather in her blunt, unyielding tone that left me reeling. At first, I thought about shrugging it off. After all, taste buds can drive the unwary to indulgence, but as weeks passed, I found myself trapping echoes of her words in the corners of my mind. Fast forward a few months later, we were preparing for my sister's wedding, a grand event that would showcase every family member and friend dressed to the nines. When my mom and I went dress shopping, I could feel anticipation buzzing in my veins, but it was bittersweet. Each dress was lovely, but as the sunlight grazed the mirror, it caught the fickle shadows of self-doubt, and every tug of fabric was accompanied by her scrutinizing gaze. Then came the moment I feared. She picked a stunning red dress and held it out like a trophy, but when I emerged from the dressing room, her reaction was not what I hoped for. "You know, honey, I think something a bit looser would suit you better," she said casually, her thin smile carrying an insidious weight. The words hung over me like a cloud threatening rain, and suddenly, all the mannequins seemed to close in around me, like they were whispering to each other. I felt the heat of shame creep through my cheeks, but something snapped. The soft, timid girl she had raised faded into the background as indignation bloomed. I stood there, heart pounding, and said, "AITA for telling Mom I will buy my own dress after she called me fat?" She blinked as if I had just thrown a glass of cold water in her face, and a shaky silence enveloped us. I turned my back, slipping back into the dressing room, and suddenly the chaos outside felt muffled, almost unreal. I wanted to scream, to cry, but instead, I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. Why did I care what she thought? I rifled through the cheap dresses on the rack. The gaudy sequins and tearing seams felt welcoming in their imperfection. I tried on a simple emerald green gown that fit me like it was tailored just for me, and when I stepped back into the light, something shifted. The vision of the woman I used to be began to morph into something brand new, something brimming with defiance. I slid into the floor-length skirt, the color wrapping around me like a promise. When I looked in the mirror, the reflection staring back wasn't just a girl burdened by her mother's words, it was a woman ready to make a statement, pursuing her independence, daring to redefine beauty on her own terms, and for the first time in a long while, I gasped with joy. I finally came to realize my worth was not tethered to the fabric my mother handed me, and as I walked back, the emerald dress swaying with each step, I could see the shift in her expression. Her eyes widened, a hint of surprise dancing in the corner of her mouth. "That actually looks lovely," she stammered, and something dark twisted in my gut, mingling anger and reluctant acceptance, as I remembered how her voice pierced through my happiness weeks ago. I shook my head, still feeling the rush of courage from leaving her disapproval behind as I answered, "Thanks, but I've decided I'll get my own dress for the wedding." The silence, thick and uncomfortable, tangled in the air between us as I could feel the tension coil tighter, her eyes flaring momentarily with disbelief before rolling into disappointment. She sighed heavily, as if the weight of disappointment in me bore down, and while I once sought her approval, this rejection tasted different. It felt like freedom. I floated to the store entrance, my heart racing but my mind clearer than it had been in weeks, and when I bought the dress on my own terms, I felt like I was taking a bold step into the future instead of shying away from past shadows. Yet in the days leading up to the wedding, I could feel her gaze lingering, a cold prickling on my back as if she were waiting for the right moment to unleash her disappointment, and I braced myself as those wedding bells chimed. When the day finally came, I felt invincible as I pulled that emerald dress over my body, my reflection glowing with defiance. I triumphed through the crowd, my dad beaming with pride, yet behind me, I could sense my mom's silence. That characteristic sharpness in her smirk was nowhere to be found. As the vows exchanged resonated before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep down, spite lingered in that corner of her heart. Maybe she thought I'd regret standing up for myself, but as I took in the twinkling lights and the wild laughter around me, I knew I wouldn't take that confidence back for anything. The reception was euphoric until, just before it crescendoed, I caught my mother's eyes across the room. She approached, and the air thickened as tension crackled between us. "You really should have let me help you pick something more flattering," she murmured, a thin smile resting on her face but a storm brewing in her expression. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt the girl I used to be creeping back, whispering to shrink under her disdain, but I wasn't having it. Channeling everything I felt the moment I decided to reclaim my story, I stated firmly, "No, Mom. This is who I am, and if you can't support me, then maybe I was right to buy my own dress after all." She hesitated, an army of emotions flashing through her eyes, and in that moment, I saw both loss and fear mingling with something close to admiration. As the music filled the room and laughter broke around us, I felt the sharp edges of my insecurities dulling, transforming into an armor I never knew I needed. We could stand in the tension of our differences, or I could embrace the freedom that came with walking away from the need for her approval. I walked away from her then, joining my friends who were twirling joyfully under the fairy lights, a smile bursting anew as I danced beneath the stars, and while I could still feel her distant gaze, it didn't pierce through my newfound strength. It simply faded into the background, a reminder that sometimes, to find yourself, you must sever the chains holding you to hurtful expectations, and in that moment, I wasn't just wearing an emerald dress, I was wearing the knowledge that I was enough, just as I am. I'm not sure how to start this without sounding melodramatic, but I need to share this before it eats me alive. My friend Danny, who, like me, is 23 years old, had been pestering me to set him up with my best friend, Laura, for months. She's beautiful, smart, and genuinely one of the best people I know. We had been friends since childhood, and after a slew of terrible dates, I thought, why not? On paper, they seemed like a match made in heaven. Both love horror movies, the same music, and they both had quirky senses of humor. But every time I tried to broker this budding romance, something fell through. He would flirt with her one moment and then completely ghost her the next, and I could see how it hurt Laura when he'd vanish as if she were nothing. Finally, I confronted Danny about it. "What's your deal? If you want to date her, then do it. Don't just toy with her feelings," I told him one night as we shared drinks. He shrugged it off, saying he was just busy. I didn't buy it, but I let it go, until the day they finally met up, a Friday night that still haunts me. When I got the call from Laura the next morning, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He stood me up, and he didn't even text me to say he wouldn't come, she choked out between sobs, and as she recounted her harrowing experience waiting in that stupid cafe with her heart in her throat, I felt rage boil within me. Danny had let her wait for 2 hours before sending a text that something came up, which is code for, "I couldn't care less about you." I spent the rest of the weekend comforting Laura, who couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She deserved better, and all I could think of was Danny's selfishness. The following week, I told Danny I was done helping him. AITA for refusing to set up my friend anymore after he stood up my best friend? I asked him directly, hoping for some sign of remorse, but he shrugged it off as if it didn't matter. He laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confines of my mind, and that's when I noticed it, the change in him, something darker lurking beneath the surface. I thought it was just disappointment at being denied a date, but then things started getting weird. A few days later, Laura and I found a note on her car windshield, scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize, reading, "You should find someone who actually wants you," and it sent chills down my spine. I dismissed it as some random jerk, but then she began receiving messages on social media from a profile with no followers or posts. The person behind it clearly knew things about her that they shouldn't have, places she frequented and inside jokes we had shared. Each time I texted Danny, he ignored me or gave flippant responses that made my stomach twist. "My bad," he'd write back. "I've been busy." I had started keeping track of the odd notes and the increasingly menacing messages Laura was receiving. They grew more and more detailed, leaning closer toward stalking. I began to wonder if it was all a sick game played by Danny to get back at Laura for humiliating him by uncovering his true nature. But I didn't confront him again, fearing what might happen if I pushed. I was convinced he was somehow involved. They were intertwined in a twisted fate that I could no longer untangle. On a freezing December evening, Laura and I went out to grab some groceries, both feeling the weight of the ominous recent events. She pulled out her phone and went pale. There it was again, a message waiting for her: "You should really stay home tonight." The lights flickered above us as a sickening chill washed over me, and I could swear that a shadow crossed over the grocery store. Moments later, Laura and I split up to grab the last few items on our list, and when I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a figure at the far end. His back was turned to me, but his posture was all too familiar. Panic surged through me. Danny had been sneaking around while I wasn't paying attention. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for me to glimpse his face, and I felt my heart drop. It wasn't Danny at all, but someone who looked alarmingly similar, a glint of madness in his eyes. I froze, the grocery list slipping from my hands. Before I could move, he took a single step toward me, and in that moment, the lights went out. All I could hear was the sound of frantic breathing and an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted, screaming for Laura as I raced through the store, grabbing at the edges of my sanity. I found her in the aisle, her face ghostly pale, and she was gripping her phone tightly, shaking. "Did you see him?" she whispered, and I nodded, still reeling from the terror of being so close to something I couldn't explain. In the following days, I made the hard choice to go to the police, warily explaining the situation. They brushed it off, saying it could be a prank, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Then, without warning, Laura disappeared. One minute she was there, and then she was gone, spilling laughter and warmth into the world, and the next, it was like she had never existed. My heart ached, frantically searching for signs of her in her usual hangouts, social media, anything, and every night I returned to my darkened apartment, guilt gnawing at my mind like the predator it had become. I finally reached out to Danny one last time, hoping against hope that he would tell me where she was, but all I got was a deadpan "You should have stayed out of it." It was a message so straightforward it cut through me, and desperation consumed me as I tried tracing back everything that had happened. It finally hit me: every dark turn we took led back to him. I couldn't let it go, and so, the next Thursday, I found myself standing outside his apartment, too many unanswered questions pulling me toward confrontation. I knocked on the door. I didn't care if I appeared insane. The door creaked open, revealing him, a sly grin stretching across his face. "Thought you might come," he said, stepping aside to let me in, as if he planned this all along. When I stepped inside, the stench hit me like a freight train. "What's wrong with you?" I managed, feeling sick. There were notes scattered everywhere, torn photographs plastered on walls, the evidence of his obsession. I saw Laura's face among them, eyes wide in terror, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "She made me do this. If you had just let me have her, none of this would have happened." I staggered backward in horror as he reached for something behind him. Was it a knife? But I dipped sideways, ducking and sprinting for the door. I burst outside, adrenaline propelling me forward, and just as I neared the stairs, I heard him call after me, a low chuckle echoing through the hallway. "See you soon." I never found Laura. The police still refused to believe me. Danny is still out there, lurking, with secrets that threaten to break through the cracks of reality. As for me, I live in fear every day that he'll find me, too, because I know what he did, and he's not done yet. So, AITA for refusing to set my friend up ever again? I guess I'll never know, as I am too afraid of what darkness lies within the heart of those you think you know. The truth is, I simply can't afford to find out. I never thought Thanksgiving would be the day everything would unravel, but here we are, just a few days away from the holiday when my brother decided to bring his new girlfriend into the family fold. Now, Logan had always been a bit impulsive, jumping from one relationship to another like a child on a trampoline, but this new girl, Tara, was something else. Our family is tight-knit, built on love and respect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her. It started a few weeks ago at a family barbecue. Tara showed up uninvited, slinking into our backyard in a low-cut dress and high heels, her laughter too loud and forced. I remember my wife, Sarah, greeting her with a warm smile, the kind that melts the heart, but Tara, with a dismissive wave, merely rolled her eyes, shooting back a caustic remark about how basic the whole event was. I felt the atmosphere freeze, Sarah's smile faltered, and the warmth of family quickly turned to awkwardness, the kind you feel in the pit of your stomach when someone's just been insulted in a room where everyone should feel safe. Despite the tension, I shrugged it off. Relationships take time, maybe she was just a little too much wine and not enough maturity. But then, the comments kept coming. It was like she had a vendetta against my wife, each word woven into a tapestry of disdain. At the next family gathering, she brought up how funny it was that I had the same job for 5 years, as if my dedication to our family's financial security was laughable, but, of course, Logan, ever the oblivious one, just laughed along. My heart raced as I watched Sarah's face contort with hurt. I approached Logan later and voiced my concerns, but he dismissed me, insisting I was being overprotective. It escalated from there, and I couldn't take it anymore. I made it clear, Tara wasn't welcome at our Thanksgiving dinner. This was a day for family, love, and gratitude, not taunts and jabs at the dinner table. When I broke the news to Logan, he went quiet, his face morphing into disbelief and anger, like I'd slapped him. "You can't just dictate who I can date," he exploded, red-faced and incensed. I stood my ground. "I'm not dictating anything, I'm protecting my family." Our conversation devolved into a fight, complete with accusations of me being controlling and unfair. It spiraled until we were both shouting, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, that I was pushing him away. But then he brought Sarah into it, saying that if she couldn't handle a little teasing, maybe I shouldn't have married her. That hit harder than any insult Tara had thrown, and I felt an icy rage boil inside me. Thanksgiving came, the air crisp and chilly, and I still buzzed with anger. Sarah was tentative around me, unsure of how to ease the tension brewing like a storm above our family eagle's nest, as she called it. I thought about all that Tara had put her through, how she had disrespected the very foundation of our lives together. The day of Thanksgiving dawned bright, but the shadow of the upcoming confrontation loomed large. I spent the day cooking, the scents of turkey and stuffing filling our home, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Logan, wondering if he'd take the high road or wash his hands of our family tradition. Then, the doorbell rang, and I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. There he stood, all confident bravado, with Tara clinging to his arm like a leech. I opened the door, plastering on a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Hey, Logan. Happy Thanksgiving," I said, already regretting every bit of small talk that was about to ensue. "Thanks, man, good to see you," he replied, his voice leaching with tension as he glanced at my face for any sign of approval. Tara, however, was a different story. Rather than grace myself with a simple hello, she leaned in close to me and whispered, "You're really upset I'm here, aren't you, sweetie?" In a tone so saccharine it made my teeth ache. I could taste the bile rising in my throat as the words hung thick in the air. I forced a laugh, but inside, I was battling the monster of rage swarming my insides. I ushered them inside and busied myself with the preparations, Sarah already setting the table with an uncharacteristically somber expression. Tara breezed around the house, commenting on the decorations, how they looked cheap, as if she had any room to talk, and I was ready to snap. Dinner came, and we all settled down, tension thick enough to slice with a knife. Small talk morphed into a battlefield, and as Tara consumed her plate, every word dripped with thinly veiled mockery directed at my wife until Sarah excused herself and left the table. I caught a glimpse of her eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, and something inside me snapped. I stood up so hard my chair toppled over. "Tara, if you can't show my wife respect in her own home, you don't deserve to be here, and neither does Logan," I spat, all of my pent-up frustration exploding in a mixture of protective love and seething anger. The table fell silent, forks frozen in midair, as Logan shot out of his chair, flaring with indignation. "You're being unreasonable." She's my girlfriend," he screamed, the table shaking under the weight of his fury. But it was Tara that caught me off guard when she leaned back and said, honestly, "Your life sounds pathetic. I feel sorry for your wife." My heart dropped like lead, the air became thick with something heavy. Was it hatred or contempt? I took a breath, steadying myself. "You're right, Tara, I do feel sorry for you. You've managed to entangle yourself with a man who clearly doesn't see the damage you're doing." Logan looked stricken, staring between us, torn. That was when I reached my breaking point, turning to him and saying, "You deserve better than this, and so does she. I'm not the bad guy here, you are. I'll choose family over a petty squabble with a woman who can't respect my wife." I suddenly felt hollow and exposed, a dark mantle of anger and shame wrapping around me. Logan shook his head in fury, and I saw a ripple of realization cross his face, the anger twisting into a profound confusion. Tara stood there, smugly, as if to say she had just won a twisted game of chess where she expected to claim the crown. That's when I kicked them out, a moment that felt both immensely satisfying and eviscerating at the same time. I slammed the door behind them, breathing heavily, my heart racing faster than it had in years as I faced the fallout. I turned to find Sarah framed in the kitchen doorway, her face a landscape of conflicting emotions, pride, sadness, and relief, all tangled into a sorrowful smile. The room felt different, lighter somehow, as we held each other's gaze, and in that moment, I knew we could withstand anything, while all I could think about was whether I had chosen rightly for my family. Maybe I wasn't in the wrong after all. The evening faded into laughter, warmth, and heads bowed in thanks, filled with new traditions where respect governed the values we all held dear. A thin veil hung over the doorway where resentment no longer dared cross. I never thought a simple act of sharing leftovers could tear my family apart, but here I am, sitting alone in my darkened living room, replaying that moment over and over, haunted by the consequences of my actions. My wife, Julia, owns a small but trendy restaurant in the heart of the city, and her passion for crafting the perfect menu is only matched by her relentless pursuit of culinary excellence. Last week, she prepared a spectacular feast for an important food critic, and despite the hours she labored over the dishes, it was a complete disaster. A botched soufflé and an unseasoned risotto meant for a table of 6 ended with her in tears and a table full of critics who abandoned their forks. Luckily, we had leftovers, and while I didn't think much of it at the time, I saw them as a potential treat for our 7-year-old son, Jeremy, who had been particularly picky lately. After a long day of work, I was exhausted and did what any parent would do. I heated up the remains of Julia's masterpiece, set it on the table, and watched as Jeremy devoured it, his delighted expressions making it feel like I had done something right. Little did I know, Julia returned home just moments later, her exhaustion quickly transforming into an explosive rage. She was furious when she learned I'd given her hard work to our child without asking her, saying that the food wasn't fit for a child and that it was a culinary embarrassment to have it enjoyed in our home. I tried to explain that I was merely trying to avoid a food wasteland, that I thought the meal was still tasty regardless of her standards, but every point I made only seemed to enrage her more. As the evening spiraled out of control, I had every intention of smoothing things over, only for the situation to morph from her yelling into accusations that my actions were disrespectful not only to her work but to her as a person, as if I had taken something far more valuable than overcooked risotto and an unappetizing soufflé. I felt as though I was losing my grasp on both my wife and the situation, and so did the unthinkable. Under the weight of her disappointment and anger, I snapped back at her, suggesting she should have been more focused on the food quality and less on the critics. How easy it was for her to blame me for a problem that simmered deeper. It was the moment she turned silent, eyes glaring, that I realized the words had crossed an irretrievable line, that I had launched us into a war I never intended to start. For days afterward, the silence felt like a living thing, hovering over our home, punctuated only by Jeremy's innocent inquiries about why Mommy seemed so upset. Julia's repertoire of silence was filled with passive-aggressive remarks and cold, short responses, her eyes narrowing when I tried to engage in anything beyond the bare minimum of conversation necessary to ensure the basic functions of family life, a stark contrast to the vivacious, affectionate woman I had fallen in love with. I had hoped we'd recover after the initial fallout, but instead, Julia's resentment festered, and soon it morphed into something darker, something almost devoid of love and warmth. She became distant, pouring herself into work at the restaurant, where she would stay late and celebrate a new batch of customers with food I wondered if she served with love or simply out of spite for me. And then came the night I sat down at my computer, typing an online thread about the entire situation. I titled it AITA for giving my kid my wife's restaurant leftovers. I poured out everything that had transpired, desperate for an outside perspective, only to be met with a storm of judgment, thousands declaring that I was the ultimate not only for disregarding her cooking but for taking away her art without even asking. The comments cut deeper than Julia's shrillest reprimands, each one a dagger twisting in my heart. Did I truly not appreciate her work? Did I really ruin what little glimmer of happiness we shared? In a whirlwind of frustration and guilt, I posted it, hoping maybe some kind souls would understand my side, but I only sunk deeper into despair. I couldn't see my reflection in her eyes anymore. It was as if she were gazing at a stranger, one who had cheated her out of validation and respect. Days turned into weeks filled with awkward dinners and increasingly frequent texts from concerned friends, worried about the cracks forming in our once solid relationship, while I spiraled into a pit of confusion and sadness. By now, any semblance of peace was gone. When I finally approached Julia to talk, her reaction was icy as she bristled and turned her back on me, my heart breaking at the sight of her shoulders hunched, each part of her signaling the grief I had caused. I tried to muster the strength to fight for our family, but it crumbled like stale bread, and Jeremy ended up sandwiched in between our personal warfare, his innocent laughter becoming a haunting reminder of our shared happiness, a skin-deep gallery of memory eclipsed by an ominous cloud. I racked my head trying to fix things, bring back that laughter, but all I found was bitterness, a constant reminder that I was perhaps wholly to blame. The last straw came on the night when Jeremy begged us to take him out to eat. I attempted to suggest we go to Julia's restaurant, a familiar comfort, but she scowled, her face freezing in a way I had understatedly believed was an unthinkable facet of my once joyful wife, and she snapped that she would rather eat trash than step foot in a place bearing my name. I had turned to Jeremy, hoping his innocent spirit could bridge the chasm between us, and when I caught a glimpse of disappointment in his eyes, I knew I had failed. Days turned into months, and everything I tried had been met with veiled hostility. I became a ghost in my own home, a failure neither of us knew how to fix, and one afternoon, a provocative thought pricked at the edges of my mind. Maybe if she couldn't see the value in me anymore, perhaps it was time to remove myself from the equation, let Julia and Jeremy continue thriving without the emotional wreckage that had invaded our lives. So, when I quietly packed a bag and slipped out the door for one last stroll, leaving my phone behind in my attempt to free us from the chaos, I thought it was the right decision. As evening settled in, I found myself wandering toward Julia's restaurant, every step heavy with resolve to push through the hurt, to give closure to my irreparable mistakes. Standing outside the bright lights and vibrant people, I took a breath to gather the courage. I was finally going to admit my faults and appeal for forgiveness, but as I stepped inside, I was greeted not with the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals but by the sight of Julia beside a tall man with an easy grin, laughing over plates that I'd once served my family. Suddenly, I found myself at the precipice of realization. In seeking to share a simple meal with my son, I had unwittingly starved the love in our home, and now it looked as though I had ushered in someone else's warmth. Maybe the leftovers were more than just food, maybe they were a reflection of the way I threw away months of fragile moments, scoffing at the delicacies we had once nourished together, and I realized, standing frozen in a place that had once felt like home, that the hardest truth any parent could face isn't just about what we serve our children, but what we allow to fill their hearts. I thought I was doing the right thing when I invited my daughter, Ella, to my wedding. It was supposed to be my special day, a celebration of love that I had waited so long for, yet it quickly turned into a nightmare that threatened to unravel everything I had built. The wedding was supposed to be child-free, a choice my fiancé and I made after years of hearing the endless howls of kids at weddings, tugging at their parents' dresses, sticky hands everywhere, but I just couldn't bear the thought of leaving Ella with a babysitter that night. Her big, brown eyes filled with trust seemed to pierce through my steely resolve. I had spent so much time and effort planning this day, but the real truth gnawed at my insides. My ex-husband and the battles over custody had stripped so much joy from my life, the kind of joy that only a parent knew. Ella was not just my daughter, she was my greatest happiness in a life littered with heartbreak. When the day finally arrived, I felt a tension knotting my stomach. My friends raised eyebrows over Ella's presence, some shot disapproving glances as she twirled in her little dress, a tiny sunshine among the cynical clouds of adult resentment. I tried to brush off their comments, reassure them that she would be quiet, but deep down I feared this decision would come back to haunt me. As we exchanged vows beneath a blooming arch, Ella's laughter punctuated the solemnity of the moment, the sound bouncing off the walls of our carefully chosen venue, and for a fleeting second, I thought that maybe I had made the right choice, that love was expansive, that it could include the children we cherished. But as the reception began, chaos erupted in a way I couldn't have imagined. Ella, normally so sweet and well-mannered, seemed to sense my anxiety. She fidgeted around the table, her previous joy twisted into a frantic whirl of energy. Guests looked on with thinly veiled discomfort, and when she knocked over a whole tray of hors d'oeuvres, the loud crash reverberated around the space like a gunshot. The laughter quickly faded into whispers, the sight of my fiancé's face crumpling into pale frustration. "This is supposed to be a special day for us, can't you control her?" he hissed through clenched teeth, and I felt my heart splinter at his words. How could he say that? She was my daughter, my little miracle bathed in sun, and in that moment, the words felt as sharp as knives. I tried to explain, tried to apologize to my guests, who were visibly uncomfortable watching my face turn crimson with embarrassment, but I could feel the judgments rise like a palpable fog, affecting even the tightest of relationships, crumbling them beneath unseen pressures. A few brave souls tried to coax Ella back into calmness, but when I witnessed her slip into the shadows, a cute little flower girl becoming a confused little shadow, I rushed after her, desperate to find her back. It was in a small alcove near the bathrooms that I first saw it, a dark figure looming. It had to be a trick of the light, perhaps a misstep of my imagination, but the way its shadows stretched unnaturally across the tiled wall made my stomach holler. I took a step back in hesitation, but Ella laughed to greet the figure, drawing closer as it engulfed her in a cold haze. Panic clawed inside me, and I lunged for her as the figure raised a pale hand that flickered like a dying bulb. "Ella, come back!" I screeched, my voice a shriek that sliced through the laughter drifting from the reception. I yanked Ella into my arms just in time, and our eyes locked, a wondrous mixture of fear and diligence coiling in her innocence, shadows shattering beneath the flickering lights above us, replacing laughter with an ominous hum. My fiancé and the guests had begun to filter toward us, drawn by my sudden panic as I tried desperately to shield her from the darkness that prowled around the corners where no one dared to look. He was furious, and when he saw how scared I was, his anger morphed into confusion, but when he looked upon Ella, my precious girl clutching my hand with terror etched into her little features, his warmth shattered. I saw it, the way his eyes flicked back to the figure, now hovering silently, a spot of ink threatening to consume my life in darkness. People were gasping as the words fell from my lips, things I could barely comprehend. "It's coming for her," but as I tried to urge him to flee, to run, the shadows engulfed the light, filling the room with whispers of my past regrets, and it seemed uncertainty struck him harder than fear, causing him to freeze as the figure drew ever closer, the darkness twirling around like wisps of smoke. As the chaos descended, guests fled to the corners, drawn into their own fears and superstitions, even if no one truly understood what was happening, and I was left holding Ella, the weight of my choices crashing like waves against my breastplate. The figure began to laugh, a twisted, echoing sound like shattered glass, and as I turned away from it to shield my daughter from the chaos, I felt the warmth seep from my soul. Nobody was coming to help. Desperation clawed at me, and with one last surge of strength, I broke free from the icy void, pushing through friends and family, shivering against the noise that raged around me to escape into the night. We barely made it to the car, the headlights flickering like the sanctity of promises broken, as that chilling laughter still echoed behind. Inside, the air grew thick with tension, a web of haunting memories woven in silence, and I tried to comfort Ella, but the truth hung in the air like a dark cloud. We barely escaped, but we still bore the burden of fear, of choices lost to shadows yearning to reclaim what it could never have. Some may say I was the villain of my own story, AITA for bringing her where she was never meant to be, but in that darkness, I started to realize that the real question was how far I would go to protect my daughter from an entity that represented all my past mistakes, draped in the guise of love and light. As we drove away, Ella's gentle question pierced through the suffocating veil, "Mom, are we ever going back?" And I didn't have an answer. I never thought that a simple no could spiral my life into a relentless nightmare, but then again, I think we often underestimate how quickly the human mind can twist itself into the shape of malice. It all started when my neighbor, who I had always considered friendly, knocked on my door one chilly autumn afternoon. He was desperate, explaining that he had family visiting and no parking space available, pleading for just one day's use of my extra spot, something I had meticulously preserved since my brother had passed. I felt guilty, even as I formed my words, recalling that it wasn't my responsibility to accommodate him. "I'm sorry, but I really need that spot," I said firmly. He blinked, disappointment flashing across his face, and for a split second, I worried I had crossed some invisible line. Okay, suit yourself, he replied, his voice slipping into that unsettling calmness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. That evening, I settled into my usual routine, but the air in my apartment felt thick and stifling, as if the walls themselves were eavesdropping. The next day, I noticed my neighbor's car parked in front of my driveway, blocking my entrance. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but now it felt like a direct challenge. I stepped outside, greeted by a swollen sense of dread. "Could you move your car?" I called out, forcing a smile that felt feeble. His response sent chills racing along my spine. "Not my fault your spot is empty, is it?" From then on, it felt like a war, each day adding fuel to the fires of resentment. He called in false complaints about my late-night music. Neighborhood Watch was informed that I had too many guests parked out front, and it wasn't long before I realized he made it clear to others that I was a nightmare neighbor. The whispers slithered through the streets like an unwelcome fog, suffocating every connection I'd formed in the block. Isolation wrapped around me, a warm but suffocating blanket. I went to my car one moonlit evening only to find it scratched, deep gashes carved across the pristine paint. I stood there, heart racing, and it hit me that this was no coincidence. When I confronted him, he merely laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that haunted me even in my dreams. It wasn't long before every friendly face in the neighborhood turned away, lost somewhere in the disarray of rumors and twisted truths. I decided to take a different route and began documenting everything, each incident meticulously noted in a notebook, the complaints, the damage, the ominous notes slipped under my door. It felt sensible at first, like a lifeline thrown into a pool of chaos, but as the pages turned, the act felt increasingly paranoid and desperate. One night, racked with anxiety, I curled up on my couch with a few glasses of wine, hoping the alcohol would dull the sharp edges of fear. While grappling with insomnia, I decided to check my doorbell camera, both for shreds of sanity and evidence. I just wanted to run through the footage of the night I had scratched paint. To my horror, I discovered something I could never have anticipated: my neighbor standing outside, wearing a thick black hoodie, his face obscured beneath the darkness of a winter night. He loomed by my car, pouring some clear liquid onto the trunk. It shimmered like a bright star when it caught the light. I panicked, realizing I had forgotten to lock my door. Shoving past the beers and the remnants of junk food, defense mechanisms against the chilling apprehension now boiling my blood, I ran to the door, my heart pounding a thunderous rhythm. I flung it open, but he was gone, leaving behind an echo of laughter that felt like ice spilling through my veins. The next day, I filed a police report, but the officer, a weary middle-aged man with coffee stains on his uniform, seemed more amused than concerned. "Just a neighbor dispute, ma'am, nothing serious," he chuckled, dismissing my escalating paranoia while I insisted through gritted teeth that his actions had crossed an unsafe line. Days turned into weeks, but the situation escalated. One morning, I woke to find my entire car was covered in eggs, some smashed and gunky, the others still intact like rotten grenades. I could no longer discern the difference between reality and a waking nightmare. Was it even possible for someone to be that vindictive? A dark reflection of my own thoughts bubbled up, suggesting maybe this monsoon of chaos wouldn't end until I retaliated, until I dove as deep into this nightmarish rabbit hole as he had. But just as I found a tiny ember of resolve within, unease cloaked me as I spied him staring at me one lonely afternoon, a wide grin plastered across his face. It twisted something inside me. Perhaps this was all a game to him. I sought answers, diving into deeper roots. I tracked whispers of past neighbors who had endured their own terror at his hands, piecing together a fractured narrative that revealed a history soaked in acrimony. Each encounter morphed into dread, the shadows thickening with lies. The sense of friendship had crystallized into something sinister. My final attempt to reclaim my space felt extravagant, even foolish. I tossed out everything I had documented and staged a confrontation I knew bordered on insanity. The night felt thick with foreboding as I cornered him outside, demanding he leave me alone, but he merely laughed again, that infuriating, deep sound that wrapped around my consciousness like a vice. "Why don't you focus on managing your own space instead of wasting time at my door?" His words rolled over me like a cold wave. In that moment, I recognized the absurdity of trying to fight someone so twisted, so bent. I stepped back, something inside me fracturing as I muttered, "You'll regret this," my voice small, an echo of fading confidence. And just as I turned to leave, I heard what felt like the closing act of a narrative gone awry, my heart halting when he called out to me one last time, "You already have." I drove that evening, not to work or friends, but to the edge of sanity, piecing together the tangled web of fear and loathing that had bared itself in my life. It took time, but in those shockingly still moments, clarity descended upon me. I understood my only option to end this sick game was to move away permanently, to cleanse myself of the taint of his shadowy presence. As I packed, every belonging stripped away from the condo felt like an entanglement burnt from me. I left that apartment a shell of who I was, yet had it ever truly been mine? I shrugged off the weight of his existence like a snake distilling its skin. But as I drove toward the next chapter in my life, with a bittersweet taste, I vowed to never forget the lesson learned. In neighborhoods where darkness breeds, kindness is a fickle facade, and sometimes refusing to let others in comes with a heavy price. I never thought a simple plate of brownies could tear my life apart, but then again, nothing about my girlfriend, Lisa, was ever simple. We'd just moved in together after dating for almost a year, and while she was the sweetest person I'd ever met, there were these odd flashes of darkness that occasionally surfaced, like that time I found her staring out the window at the neighbors, grinning eerily, a finger pressed to her lips, and she just muttered something about keeping the family together. I chalked it up to her quirky personality. We all have our weirdness, right? So, when she came home one evening bubbling with excitement, holding a plate of brownies she'd baked from scratch, I genuinely wanted to be thrilled about it, but something felt off. The scent wafting through the apartment was heavenly, rich chocolate mixed with a hint of vanilla, yet it felt tainted with an inexplicable weight. She placed them on the table, her eyes sparkling with anticipation as if they were the manifestation of her love for me, and I wanted to tell her how fantastic they looked, but bile crept up my throat. I hesitated, glancing at her. "I'm not really hungry," I muttered, hoping she'd merely brush it off, but instead, she flared up like a match ignited by the spark of a breath. "You don't like them?" she shouted, and despite the ghostly shadows that danced just beyond her smile, it hit me like a freight train. I'd stepped on hallowed ground. I tried to defend myself, to explain that it was just a lack of appetite and not a reflection of her baking skills, but that only seemed to deepen the frown that replaced her earlier glee. Fighting the sensation of dread gnawing at me, I retreated to my room, needing the safety of solitude to gather my thoughts, but it felt like a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd awakened something I shouldn't have, and as the hours passed, I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, soft mutterings merging with the darkening night. Eventually, sleep dragged me into a nightmare I'd never forget. I saw Lisa standing above me, her face illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the window, but there was something unsettling about her smile, something predatory, yet she offered me a brownie, insistent, as the shadows coiled around her in an embrace. I woke with a start, sweat-soaked sheets clinging to my skin, the faintest echo of her whisper still ringing in my ears, a siren's lure, "Just one, darling." When morning came, an overwhelming unease clung to my chest like a weight, and I avoided her gaze over breakfast, worried about how drastically my words had shifted the atmosphere. "Are you sure you don't want to try one?" she asked, a tremor of desperation more than mere sweetness creeping into her tone. "I'll save them for later," I replied vaguely, but I meant it more as a peace offering than genuine interest. However, days turned into weeks, and inevitably, the uneaten brownies loomed like a specter. In the corner of our home, a silent reminder of my supposed ingratitude. The tension crackled like static in the air, thick and almost electric, until one fateful evening, that familiar plate of brownies made a terrifying return. Lisa approached me with a different energy, her smile was tight and her eyes glimmered ominously. "I found a way to make them even better," she declared, and I could hardly recognize the voice coming from her lips. I feigned enthusiasm, but inside, an instinct screamed at me to flee. What could she possibly mean by better? My mind raced, recalling snippets of conversations we had about organic ingredients, the herbs she was so into that I dismissed as harmless eccentricities. I felt the walls closing in around me as she set the plate down and leaned closer, her gaze almost molten. "You're still upset I made them, aren't you?" she asked, the innocent facade peeling away like paint from an old wall. "I'm not ungrateful, Lisa. Really, it was just," she cut me off with a derisive laugh that chilled me to the bone, and suddenly, it all spiraled into a confrontation neither of us wanted but couldn't seem to escape. I screamed something about her obsession with those brownies, how her moods hinged on my reaction to them, and that's when I saw it, a flash of something lurking in her eyes, something dark and consuming. "You don't understand," she hissed, taking a step back, the slight tremor of her voice betraying what brutality lurked beneath. "Once you've tasted my brownies, there's no going back. You'll want more. I promise." The way she smiled made my skin crawl, like a snake licking its lips before it strikes, and I knew then that my refusal was merely a prelude to something horrific. Panic surged. I needed to leave and put distance between myself and the sinister weight of her words. I slammed the door behind me, vowing to never return, but in the night, as darkness crushed the light, her voice followed me. "You'll regret this," she promised, each syllable dripping with malice as I ran into the streets, desperate to escape my own mind. Days turned into nightmares. I could feel her watching me, waiting, as the uneaten brownies sat like a silent curse in the corner of my dreams. Friends grew concerned. I could hardly hold a conversation. Paranoia wrapped me in an icy grip, and I convinced myself that she could sense my fear like a predator stalking prey. I moved in with a friend, but every creak of the floorboards felt like her footsteps trailing me, every shadow reminding me of her wide grin, and those damned brownies flashed in my mind like a harbinger of doom. Then one evening, just as I was curling up on the couch with trembling hands, there was a knock at the door, a seemingly benign sound, yet it sent ice coursing through my veins. I approached cautiously, peeking through the peephole, and there she was, Lisa, standing with that same plate of brownies held against her chest like a shield, her hair wild and disheveled, a manic light in her eyes. "You didn't say goodbye," she said sweetly, and before I could respond, I found myself under the spell of her haunting smile. The door flew open, and I was trapped in that infernal gaze. "I made them for you. Just one, darling, and everything will be all right," she murmured, words curling around me like tendrils of smoke. In that moment, all I could do was stare at the brownies, their dark, glossy surface beckoning me closer, the aroma filling my nostrils with a singular promise: bliss. I swayed slightly, teetering between hunger and fear, but then I saw something in the swirl of chocolate, something darker than mere sweets, something deep and twisted, teeth, shining stark white against the dark backdrop. I stumbled back, horror flooding through me as I realized she hadn't been baking at all but crafting a sinister concoction meant to bind me to her forever. "You'll regret not eating them," she said, her voice reverberating through my entire being, and as I ran, her laughter echoed behind me, melding into the shadows, intertwining with every dark corner of my mind. As I sprinted away from the apartment, I knew then what I had truly awakened. This was her devotion, a sacrifice they didn't tell you about in romantic fairy tales, and there was no way to uneat the brownies I hadn't tasted. They had already taken a piece of me. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece at the last minute would lead to the nightmare that I am now living in. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday night. I had been looking forward to a solo evening binge watching my favorite shows, just curled up in my blanket with a bowl of popcorn, when my sister called. She was in a panicked frenzy because her plans with friends had fallen through at the last minute and she needed someone, anyone, to watch her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. I hesitated, knowing full well that Lily's recent behaviors had made me uncomfortable. In the past few months, she'd been acting strangely, saying odd, almost unsettling things, like how she saw shadows move in the corners of her room or how her dolls would talk to her about things she couldn't possibly have known. I always shrugged it off as childhood imagination or just an overactive mind, but something in my gut twisted at the thought of being alone with her for several hours. "I can't," I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. "I have plans." The voice on the other end didn't take it well. My sister began to plead, insisting that I was being selfish, but I stood my ground. "It's just one night," I thought as I hung up, relieved until I glanced out the window and saw a shadow pass by my front door. It felt ridiculous, I told myself. It was just the wind or some stray cat, maybe even my imagination running wild, but then I heard a light tapping at the glass. I brushed it off as the tree branches swaying in the evening breeze, or maybe just my overactive mind playing tricks on me, until the tapping became a steady knock. My heart raced as I cautiously peeked through the peephole, and for a split second, I saw a small figure standing there, swaying slightly under the porch light. Instinctively, I swung open the door to confront whatever was there, only to see nothing. Just an empty porch, the night air wrapped around me like a heavy cloak. Dismissing everything as some childish prank or a figment of my imagination, I locked the door, shaking my head at my foolishness. I turned back to the TV, trying to immerse myself in the glow of the screen, but kept feeling that sense of dread resting at the back of my mind. As I settled back into the sofa, I convinced myself it was just nerves from the confrontation with my sister. But the unease lingered. I could feel it pressing against my chest, suffocating me as the night dragged on. I decided to distract myself with a few episodes before bed, but just as I'd settled in, my phone buzzed. It was my sister, text after text flooding in. "Please, I'm desperate." Lily's acting strange. I need help. Where are you? My stomach twisted as I read her frantic messages. I was about to reply when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of giggles, soft and high-pitched, floating from somewhere outside my window. My heart thumped painfully against my rib cage, and I stood up, moving closer to the window to peer out into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows pooling at the foot of the trees in my yard. But then my eyes caught a flash of something pale, and I noticed it wasn't just shadows dancing in the wind, it was Lily, standing at the edge of my lawn, her hair tangled over her face, her little hands clutching her doll, which seemed impossibly larger than her. Panic erupted in my chest as I realized she'd somehow gotten here despite my refusal. I rushed to the door, flinging it open to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat when I saw her face. She was smiling, and it was wrong, too wide, contorted in a way that felt inhuman, and her eyes glinted in the dark like they were lit from within. "Auntie," she shouted, her voice echoing eerily, sounding less like a child and more like an echo of something dark. "Come play with us." "Us?" I stammered, my stomach churning, but before I could process what was happening, she tilted her head, and the darkness around her seemed to shudder, hundreds of little whispers threading through the air like icy fingers. I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that she wasn't alone. I'd read stories about evil things hiding in the guise of children. I stepped back instinctively, heart racing, but her eyes locked onto mine. They were vacant, swirling like storm clouds. "Don't be scared, Andy. I've brought my friends," she purred, the shadows behind her deepening and looming closer. Panic coursed through my veins, and I slammed the door, retreating to the safety of my home, my mind spinning with the horror of what I had seen. I tried to convince myself it was just a child's folly, a trick of the light, but the knocking started again, more insistent this time. It wasn't a steady knock, though, it felt like fingers, hundreds, scratching at the door, their whispers creeping through the cracks. I fumbled for my phone, contemplating calling my sister, but what would I say? Her daughter was out there with friends? I needed to think. The second I gathered myself to move toward the kitchen for some water, the lights flickered ominously, plunging me into darkness for a heartbeat before they returned. That was when I heard the unmistakable sound of giggling again, now layered with whispers, words tumbling into one another that sent my heart racing. I had to open the door, reassure Lily somehow, tell her it was all okay, but when I cautiously opened it again, instead of the small child, I was met by a hollow laugh that sent ice through my bones. The porch was empty, yet there was a chill in the air that spoke of menace, something lurking just beyond the light. "Auntie, come out and play," echoed through the night, and my instincts screamed for me to retreat. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest as I shut the door, bolting it securely and retreating further into my home, but I could still feel those eyes, those countless eyes watching through the dark, just waiting. I stumbled through the hallway to find a weapon, anything that could offer me a sense of security, when I noticed something on the floor. A small shadow lay near my feet, casting an impossible silhouette on the wall. It was Lily's doll, the one she always carried, its glassy eyes glittering even in the dim light. I recoiled in horror as the whispers intensified, now clearer and rising to a frenzy. "She's not yours anymore. We want her home. Come out, come out." They wrapped around my thoughts, making me feel warm, comfortable, even as dread clawed at my throat. I couldn't let them have her. Suddenly, the lamps flickered, casting chaotic shadows across the room, bringing to life dark silhouettes that danced on the walls. Just when I thought the chaos had reached its peak, a chorus of giggles rang out, echoing all around me. I knew I had to act before it was too late. Rushing to the back door, I grabbed my jacket and flung it on, preparing to face whatever awaited in the dark. But the sounds grew louder, almost jubilant, a cacophony of twisted mirth that echoed through the hall. I gripped the handle and swung the door open, ready to confront whatever shadowy monstrosity awaited, but all I found was the glassy-eyed doll sitting on my step, its pale face turned towards me, grinning, with Lily's giggles chiming in the air. "You can't escape us, Auntie. We're already home." That's when I knew I had made the wrong decision. I choked on my breath, realizing that in refusing to watch my niece, I had invited terror into my life, and the very shadows I thought I'd escaped were now closing in, the whispers wrapping around me, claiming me for their own. When my in-laws announced their planned visit, I had mixed feelings. Their last visit had left me exhausted, and their habit of criticizing my parenting and my home loomed large in my mind, so I decided to child-proof our house even more than usual. It felt necessary, not just for my peace but also for the safety of my 3-year-old daughter, Ava, who could turn any mundane object into a weapon of chaos. I began with the basics: outlet covers, strapping the heavy bookshelf to the wall, and locking away any potentially harmful items. But as I rummaged through the cabinets for anything that might hand my in-laws an excuse to criticize, I stumbled upon an old shoebox filled with knickknacks from my childhood. Inside, I found an ornate porcelain figurine that my mother had insisted on keeping in the living room, a delicate ballet dancer with a lifted dress and pointed toes, fragile yet hauntingly beautiful. A chill ran down my spine at the thought of Ava breaking at the moment Grandma laid eyes on it. So, I tucked it away in the attic, convinced it was the responsible thing to do. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every corner, every shelf was scrutinized. I installed more baby gates than I could count and even placed breathable netting over our balcony railing. It was excessive, but I wanted to avoid the shame of an "I told you so" from my in-laws, should the worst happen. The night before their arrival, I barely slept. My mind raced, plagued by visions of what might go wrong: a splinter, a bruise, or worse, an injury. When the morning came, I was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every sound. As I sat in anxious silence with Ava, the doorbell rang. The moment my in-laws stepped inside, my stomach twisted. I could see my father-in-law's judgmental gaze scanning our living room, taking in the extra safety measures, dissecting them with quiet disdain. But a part of me felt triumphant because I felt like I'd done my part to protect my daughter. They greeted Ava with a syrupy sweetness that made me even more uneasy. As the day progressed, my in-laws prattled on about their lives in the city, how much better things were there, and I bit my tongue to hold back a million retorts about the pressures of city living. Their comments turned to parenting advice before long, filled with passive-aggressive suggestions that sent my blood pressure soaring. I steered them away from danger zones. The balcony is off-limits, because of the netting. But they insisted that Ava could handle it. And then I heard it, a soft, yet unmistakable sound from above. The attic. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Could my daughter have found a way up? I excused myself, my heart racing, and bounded upstairs 2 steps at a time, convinced I'd find her playing among the cobwebs. The attic door creaked open, and I stepped into the dim light, expecting to find calamity awaiting. Instead, I was met only with silence. Maya scanned the room, landing on the old shoebox, a single beam of light catching on the porcelain dancer. But when I approached, my hand brushed against a pile of items hidden beneath a dust-covered blanket, and I froze. It was personal stuff, my old toys, and also something that wasn't mine, a rusted knife, half buried beside an old doll. I recoiled, backing away, but the moment did send chills through me. Why on earth was a knife up here? Just as I took a breath to regain my composure, a loud crash echoed downstairs. I bolted down the stairs, the whisper of dread trailing behind me. Upon entering the living room, I nearly fainted. Ava sat on the floor amidst the ruins of a table lamp, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and pure delight. My in-laws were glaring at her, my mother-in-law shielding her mouth in horror as my father-in-law reached for the phone to call someone. I panicked. "It's just a lamp," I practically screamed, gripping Ava as she chimed in cheerfully, obliviously proud of her little escapade. "Look, Mommy, I knocked it over." But my mother-in-law wasn't done. She launched into a tirade about how I needed to control my child, the implications of an uncluttered house cutting deeper than the knife I'd found. I felt my heart racing in my chest, rage bubbling over as I snapped back. "I'm just trying to keep her safe." "Is that a crime?" The air thickened with tension, words spilling out like toxic waste. Ava whimpered as the shouting echoed around her, turning her giggles into tears. My memory of the rusted knife clawed at me, whispering the dangers lurking in the corners of parental responsibility. The in-laws left that day under a cloud of disappointment that carried through the air like a death knell. After they left, I turned to Ava, feeling more defeated than ever. It was just a table lamp, but I could sense too much had been awakened. That night, I found myself back in the attic, drawn to the violated innocence of my childhood treasures. I didn't care that I was scaring myself. I needed to understand why someone would have hidden that knife. As I pulled the doll from the pile, I was unprepared for the sight of something I'd never noticed before, stitched into the fabric, a single word in fading thread: "Help." The letters blurred together until a memory from so long ago slapped me in the face. It was my mother's warning, a phrase I hadn't thought about since childhood, a nondescript caution about strangers, but I had dismissed it then, just as I had dismissed the weird unease my in-laws always stirred within me. Parental instincts, they say, are born through fear, but I realized my fear ran deeper this time. The knife, the warnings, the porcelain dancer, it all fit into a secret puzzle of silence that I thought had been long forgotten. Suddenly, the mundane act of child-proofing my house felt like a wake-up call to a monstrous reality. I climbed back down, determined but unnerved. Nothing else mattered now, I had to protect Ava. The old fears returned in waves, whispering the awful truth that sometimes, the real dangers come not from our children, but from the shadows we inadvertently bring into our lives. And as I stood guard at Ava's bedroom door that night, listening to her soft breathing, I felt the eerie sensation of being watched, as if the shadows were deliberating, waiting for an opportunity to rise. The next time my in-laws planned a visit, I'd have to make a choice: would I child-proof against the world, or would I prepare for the secrets that hid behind the look of disappointment on their faces? When I was a little girl, I dreamt of my wedding day with a fervor that would make even the most hard-hearted cynical adult roll their eyes, and if you had asked me then, I would have told you that my dream dress was a breathtaking pink gown, the kind that twirled like cotton candy beneath layered lights at sunset. Fast forward to my engagement, and my fiancé, Derek, was everything I could ask for. His smile lit up my world, and his laughter felt like home. But when I finally unveiled my cherished vision of a pink wedding dress to him, the look on Derek's face fell faster than I could catch it. He chuckled, which only deepened the crease across his brow. I pictured white, you know. Traditional. For the photos. As if my heart hadn't already begun to sink, I tried to brush off his hesitation, assuring him that love was what mattered most, and pink could be the essence of our shared joy. I revisited the boutique alone, the walls decorated in thousands of hues of white, and there, hanging like a forgotten story, was my original vision, a delicate pink dress, with a satin underlay that shimmered like the dawn. I slipped it on and stood before the mirror, and for the briefest moment, I felt perfect. I chose to go ahead with what my heart desired and marked the day with pink every step of the way: a pink cake, pink flowers, even pink shoes. What should have been a joyful time took a perilous turn when I announced those plans at our engagement party, where friends and family gathered, the city skyline glowing behind them. Family members gave polite claps, but I noticed my mother's jaw tighten and my grandmother's eyes narrow. What happened to the beautiful white wedding dresses? My mother questioned, her tone dripping with disapproval. It felt as if the air thickened, my smile wavering under the weight of their stares. Derek, after lagging behind with a muted expression, pulled me aside later, voicing his concerns in a hushed whisper, words about tradition and expectations spilling forth, drowning me in regret. "You know it's important to my family, right?" The doubt nestled itself in my stomach like a lead weight. My heart raced as he tried to convince me that I should reconsider, but it was too late to turn back. I was headfirst submerged in a sea of satin pink and deep disappointment. I had visions of our special day twisting like a terrifying dream I couldn't wake from, and the anxiety seeped into the planning, igniting late-night arguments that pushed him away from me instead of drawing us closer. The week before the wedding loomed like a storm cloud, the colors clashed so vividly with the black and white portrait of my future in-law's expectations. I couldn't sleep, the pink parasol and blush decorations filling every corner of my mind like quicksand. It was like a haunting chorus, and just before I drifted into a restless sleep, I found myself centered once more, a dreamlike image of walking down an aisle of happiness. All that mattered was our love and not the color of my dress. Then, on the day before the wedding, I received a message from my brother. "Mom and Dad are fighting. It's bad." A wave of dread washed over me as I found myself torn between my loyalty to my family and my heart's desire. The chasm widened between my decisions, and on the fateful morning, I donned my pink dress alone in the hotel suite, my mother's disapproval echoing like a ghost trapped between and among all the swirling laughter of pre-wedding chaos. The sight of myself sent adrenaline rushing through my veins. I did look beautiful. As the ceremony began, however, I spotted Derek's family, shoulders rigid and jaws tight. My heart sank further with every step that carried me into their line of sight. Their eyes, void of understanding, chased away the joyful spark I had longed for. By the time we exchanged vows in front of our loved ones, I felt a churning pit of anxiety in my stomach. I wished for one person to embrace me and validate my choices, and yet I found only silence from my family's corner. The flush of embarrassment was invaded further, creeping in like vines on ancient stone. After the ceremony, as we danced surrounded by a bittersweet haze of joy and resentment, my grandmother confronted me about my foolhardiness. "You won't honor tradition? On a day meant to bind your families." Her words were like shards of glass, and I fought the urge to scream. I tried to defend my actions, a flimsy paper boat riding the turbulent waves of emotion, and soon the reception spiraled into chaos. Derek's voice pierced through the crowd, a mix of frustration and disappointment mirrored in his eyes as I stood before my family and his, my pink dress like bandages on wounds that would never heal. The noise blurred into a cacophony of judgment and misunderstanding, laughter stained with unceremonious rejection, and in that moment, I felt a distinct fracture forming. The tension thickened so much that it became impossible to navigate. The phone rang, breaking the anguished silence that shifted our worlds into turmoil. My father, voice tremulous, came hurtling into the room. "You need to come home. Now." Panic rose within me, as dread settled deep in my bones, an omen I couldn't escape. I thought about that pink dress, now drenched in symbolic blood. What was a celebration had become a battleground, leaving behind only the ruins of my dreams hanging like broken glass. When Derek saw the fear flashing in my eyes, he took my hand, pulling us away from their judging glares. "We'll make this right," he whispered, but I had no idea what that meant, whether our love could withstand the chaos we had unleashed. Yet a sliver of hope pierced through the shadows as we stepped beyond the threshold of acceptance and rejection, the pink fabric swirling around me, a whirlwind of sorrow and love intertwined. In those moments filled with disbelief, it became painfully clear that weddings shouldn't be a battlefield, yet here we found ourselves entrenched. Now a question ignited within: AITA for drama over a pink wedding dress? As I processed the fallout creeping into our lives, one thing was certain: it would take more than a color to define the love we were scrambling to salvage. I never thought that allowing my mother to host Thanksgiving dinner at my house would lead to such chaos, but here we are, 3 days away from the holiday, and all I can think about is how I may have opened the door to something unspeakable. My wife, Sarah, is heavily pregnant with our 4th child and has been feeling exhausted and anxious, so I thought it would be a kind gesture to let my mother take over the cooking this year. She's been insisting on bringing her classic turkey and stuffing for as long as I can remember, and although my mother is eccentric, let's just say her ideas about food are unique, she promised she wouldn't do anything too outlandish this time. Since our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple, I've always felt the pressure of blending our families in the presence of holiday cheer, and Sarah has been under so much stress already. But as the day approaches, I've started to notice things that make my skin crawl. It began when my mother presented a package of what she claimed were secret spices for the turkey, each ingredient labeled with cryptic names. She explained they were traditional family recipes passed down for generations, but there was something eerie about the way her eyes sparkled when she mentioned them, like a wolf revealing its meal after a successful hunt. Sarah, noticing my discomfort, told me to ease up and let my mom have her fun, but late at night, when it was just the 3 of us and the kids were asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, testing her concoctions and humming strange lullabies that felt foreign, even menacing, in their melody. The scent of the spices wafting into the living room was strangely intoxicating, laced with an undertone that made me feel both dizzy and anxious, and every time I tried to confront her, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, claiming it was all in good spirit and for the family. It was around this same time that I found our youngest, Emma, talking to what she described as an invisible friend who made her giggle loudly at odd moments. Kids her age often have imaginary friends, but when I pried deeper, Emma's stories took on a bizarre, unsettling tone. "He says Grandma's food is magic and that we're all invited to dinner," she'd say, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation, as if she were caught between a dream and a nightmare. As Thanksgiving Day neared, my anxiety spiraled, and it didn't help that Sarah was increasingly sleepy and withdrawn, unable to shake what she described as a lingering fog in her mind. It was then that I went to look for my mother, only to find her hunched over the kitchen table, her fingers dripping with purple-red juices that I didn't want to think too hard about. "I'm just preparing the turkey, sweetie, don't worry," she said with an unsettling grin that stretched across her face, revealing crooked teeth that seemed to glisten with something unholy. I saw a glimpse of the turkey. Its skin was unnaturally glossy, and there were an array of small, round wounds where the feathers had once lain, looking almost like a string of pearls encased in the fleshy, glistening skin. "Where did you get this?" I uttered, trying to keep my throat from constricting too tightly. My mother looked back at me, her expression shifting from affectionate to something feral, and though she didn't answer, the air in the room thickened with a kind of infectious dread. I stumbled backward, grappling with the chill creeping up my spine, convinced my mother was losing her mind. Before I could leave, she whispered, "They'll love it, they were waiting for you," and my heart raced painfully at the insinuation. It was without question a breaking point. I confronted Sarah, suggesting we uninvite my mother, but her response left me stunned. "Let her do this, please. I think I need it. I don't want to deal with anything else right now." I pestered her for weeks, but with that hint of desperation in her voice, I felt backed into a corner. Thanksgiving came, and the atmosphere was rife with tension. I attempted to remain composed as friends and family arrived, but a discomforting strain hung over us, a dark cloud shrouding the festivities. The food, glistening in all its macabre beauty, began to arrive, turkey adorned with crimson glimmers, sides overflowing with vibrant colors, the very air filled with an intoxicating sweetness that made my head spin. As we sat at the table, I eyed the kids, who eagerly hovered over the food, whispering secrets amongst one another, fueled by some silent pact I couldn't grasp. I watched in horror as they took their first bites, followed by delightful gasps and soft giggles, every forkful seeming to ignite their spirits to heights I'd never seen before, yet there was an edge of something primal in their delight. The adults, too, were transfixed, chatting joyfully as if no one else could sense the creeping chill between us, the hallucinations in the corners of visions that twisted laughter into darker sounds. My chest tightened as I felt my mother's gnarled fingers brush against my shoulder, and she leaned in to whisper, "They told me this day would come, that all would be well. Don't you see, this is how we keep the magic alive?" I felt ice coil around my heart, the ominous weight of her words settling deep within me. The moment Emma leaned across the table, her smile too wide, too predatory, to announce that Grandma's magic tastes so good. And my body began to betray me, the urge to scream battling against my instinct to protect. And then, just as quickly, I felt my resolve waver, almost collapsing under the deliciously dark enchantment that twisted through the air like invisible threads binding us all. That evening blurred between reality and terror, all of us trapped in a dreamscape where joy danced alongside malevolence. I realized with a jolt that the children were not simply enjoying a Thanksgiving feast, something dangerous was unfolding. Before I could act, the lights flickered, plunging us into shadows, and as confusion reigned, Sarah's voice echoed through the darkness, "We're all just pieces in her game," tinged with an eerie, knowing calmness, as if she were in on a secret knowing I could not comprehend. At that moment, I felt an exhilarating thrill of the macabre awakening deep inside, tearing at the ties of sanity as I become a spectator in this grotesque festival, watching my family become enraptured, my mother's soft laughter raking through the cracks of normality, as they surrendered to a feast that was anything but ordinary. I could hear a soft chant rise from the children, their words swirling like whispers carried on the wind, and that night, as darkness settled, I understood that I had failed my family. What I had thought to be a simple holiday dinner had turned into a horrifying rite, where every bite tightened the grip of something lurking, hungry, at the edges of my world, drawn in by a maternal force that would stop at nothing to ensure that this Thanksgiving would never end. I never thought that helping my family would lead me down such a dark path, but here we are. The sun hung low when my niece Sarah showed up at my door last fall, tears streaming down her face, her voice faltering as she explained how she'd fought with her parents and was scared to go home. Without thinking twice, I opened my apartment to her, thinking her stay would be temporary, just a couple of nights before she returned to her parents, but as days turned into weeks, her desperation seemed to morph into something much darker. At first, I tried to be the support she needed. I offered her meals, a cozy bed, and even advised her about school and her budding interests, but after a while, I noticed unsettling changes. What started as a sweet, albeit troubled girl began to warp before my eyes. She would sit in the corner of the living room for hours, whispering to herself, her eyes filled with a hollow, manic light, and when I would ask her about it, she'd brush it off, claiming she was just figuring things out or working through her emotions, dealing with the stress of family conflict. But there were nights when I'd wake to the sound of her voice echoing in the hallway, practicing words I couldn't decipher, and once, I dared myself to peek through a crack in her bedroom door. I wouldn't have believed my own eyes if I hadn't seen it. She was surrounded by a circle of candles and strange drawings that looked all too similar to symbols I'd seen in horror documentaries. With an unnerving conviction, she scribbled furiously in a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. As the weeks dragged on, I felt the walls of my apartment closing in, the air thick with an urgency I couldn't explain, and then came the night that broke me. It was late, and I'd finally drifted off, haunted by the whispers from earlier, when a loud crash jolted me awake. My heart raced as I rushed to find Sarah standing in her room, her eyes wild, revealing a tangle of anger and fear. "I told you to leave me alone." She screamed at me like I'd committed the worst sin. Confused, I tried to calm her, but she just pointed to a stained piece of paper on her bed, filled with alarming incantations that made my skin crawl. I recoiled, instinctively backing away, and just as I did, her demeanor shifted, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. It wasn't my sweet niece anymore. It felt like I was looking into the eyes of someone else entirely, someone who had slipped into darkness I couldn't fathom. "You're trying to take me from it, aren't you?" she hissed, her voice twisted and guttural, and as dread washed over me, I realized that this wasn't about family disputes anymore. That night, I made a choice. I couldn't stay in my place anymore. Fears wrapped around my consciousness like vines tightening around a helpless tree, and in that moment, I felt more like the intruder than she did, a stranger in my own home. Instead of kicking her out that night, I made excuses, offered profound apologies, saying I needed space, a moment of understanding, but it was just me buying time for what I knew was an inevitable confrontation. The next day, I packed my things, reciting mantras in my mind about protecting myself, trying to shake off the layers of fear that clung to me like cobwebs. By the time dusk settled, I could no longer ignore the prickling sense of danger curling in my gut. With shaky hands, I decided to confront Sarah one last time. I found her melty from the day's heat in the living room, her eyes glossing over as she played with the remnants of what I had once thought was her childlike enthusiasm. "I need you to go home, Sarah," I said, every syllable tasting bitter as it left my lips. Panic bloomed in her gaze. It was a telltale sign of the looming storm. "You don't get to decide, Uncle," she spat, her tone turning venomous as she crept closer, lips twisted into a mirthless smile. "You're not my family anymore." It was at that precise moment that I saw that awful drawing again, harmlessly placed at my feet, and I panicked, the reality of the situation crashing down like thunderous waves on a fragile shore. The words tumbled out before I could take them back. "Get out." The words echoed in the corners of the room, reverberating off the walls like I'd broken a silence that should have remained sacred. She went still, a predator's intensity falling across her features as she started to smile, a grin that pushed the boundaries of human emotion as she took one deliberate step towards me. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I turned on my heel, stumbling toward the door, quick as a shadow, and in my flight, I could hear her laughter, frighteningly joyful, echoing in the hallways as I fled my own home. I did what I thought was necessary, forcing me to question the walls that once sheltered me. Was I right to kick her out when she needed help? Or did my actions unleash something far worse, something dark, as I fled from the very bond of family meant to shelter and protect? I stayed with a friend that night, but the reality settled on my chest like a lead weight. I could hear her whispers ringing in my ears, and I couldn't help but wonder if Sarah had truly been lost to darkness or if it was me who had cast her into those depths by abandoning her in her moment of need. Now, every time I close my eyes, I hear her chilling laughter and wonder, am I safe, or did I just make a deal with something I can't comprehend? I never thought a simple act of love would spiral into a nightmare, but here I am, trapped in a dark web of regret and horror. It all began when my daughter, Claire, who had been a vibrant light in my life, introduced me to her partner, Mia, and their gorgeous twin daughters, Lily and Rose. They were the kind of girls who left trails of glitter and laughter wherever they went, but with their busy lives and my own responsibilities, I felt that a handmade gesture would reconnect us all. So, I spent weeks sewing two cozy, colorful quilts adorned with intricate patterns of flowers and butterflies, one for each girl. The day I presented them, the delight in their eyes made every cut and stitch worth it, and at that moment, I basked in their joy, never knowing the darkness that lay ahead. It wasn't long after that, on a seemingly ordinary weekend, that strange things began to happen. It started when Lily fell ill with what Claire insisted was a common cold, but the next day, Rose also came down with the same symptoms. Then, a week later, Claire reached out to me in a panic. The girls had developed strange rashes on their arms and legs that seemed to flare up after curling up under the very quilts I had made. I felt a prick of unease, but I dismissed it, thinking it must have been an adverse reaction to the fabric I had used. "They'll be fine," I reassured her, though my heart was pounding as I hung up the phone. Then, more disturbing occurrences began to pile up. The family's cat, a fluffy tabby named Muffin, went missing, and one night I distinctly heard hushed voices coming from the girls' room. Concerned, I knocked, and Claire opened the door just enough to peek through, her face as pale as the moonlight illuminating the hallway. I could see the girls huddled under the blankets, whispering, but not talking to anyone as I recognized, perhaps playing some innocent game. Yet their giggles seemed unnaturally high-pitched and echoed unsettlingly in my ears. I brushed it off as growing pains of parenthood and carried on, crafting more quilts to send their way in a futile attempt to brush the darkness away. That wrong turn led me down a path of disbelief when one evening, as I looked through my sewing supplies, I stumbled upon something horrifying, tiny strips of fabric that looked almost like hair. Horrified, I collapsed into a parent's worst nightmare. The girls weren't just playing, they were weaving something. Something darker than I could fathom. I found myself waking up in cold sweats, the images of my beloved grandchildren flickering in flame-like visions, the sound of their laughter turning into shrill screams. Barely sleeping, I found myself almost instinctively checking in on them more often, but each visit felt more shadowy than the last. One Friday night, driven by an unfathomable pull, I decided to follow those haunting whispers. It led me to the door of their room once more, but this time something shifted in me. Instead of fear, a deep curiosity consumed me. Peeking through the crack made my breath hitch. The girls were seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a circle of candles illuminating a strange symbol drawn in chalk. Before them lay the quilts, their colors appearing almost too vibrant, too alive, and they were using them as an altar of sorts. I opened the door wider, my heart hammering, to find the girls chanting in a language I couldn't comprehend, their innocent faces now twisted into something unsettling, eyes too old for their little bodies, gleaming with a hunger I had never seen before. They turned to me in unison and smiled, revealing teeth that glinted unnaturally in the candlelight. "Join us, Grandma," they chimed, voices thick with something unnameable. I didn't know what to do. Every maternal instinct screamed for me to pull them away from whatever malevolence they were dabbling in, yet another part of me, perhaps the deeper, darker part, was both terrified and fascinated. I backed away, closing the door quietly, wanting to give them space while also terrified for their safety. I tried calling Claire, but my hands shook too violently to dial correctly as dread choked me. The following week spiraled out of control. The more I tried to distance myself from the girls, the more the dark energy seemed to repulse me. It became evident to me that their rashes had worsened, and I saw a subtle change in Claire too: tangled hair, dark circles under her eyes, a sense of fatigue that aged her rapidly. When I finally managed to pry it from her lips, Claire admitted the girls had started talking about the night of offerings and other strange rituals, things that had no place in a child's imagination, and I felt faint. Panic surged through my veins. I needed to act before it spiraled completely out of control, but every time I tried to confront Mia and Claire, they brushed it off as just childhood imagination, but as their grandmother, I couldn't shake that feeling. I snuck around their house one night while they were out, trying to gather anything unusual. In the attic, buried beneath old toys, I found a tattered book filled with illustrations of symbols and relentless incantations. I flipped through it, confusion giving way to horror as the truth struck me: a dark lineage, a twisted legacy that my family seemed to have avoided, but now threatened to awaken with my innocent gestures of love. I ripped the book shut and stumbled out of the house, barely breathing, feeling the weight of my actions suffocate me. The quilting I thought would bind our family together was pulling me into something far more sinister. A choice had to be made. I began to cut ties, slowly withdrawing from their lives, desperate to protect my own sanity, but the girls grew more insistent, more invasive, as if sensing my fear and reluctance. At a family gathering later, I watched them closely. Something shifted in me when Rose smiled at me, a smile that seemed almost predatory. I felt as though she knew the truth of my cowardice. When I could take it no longer, I gathered everyone and blurted out all I had found, all that I had deciphered from the tattered book. Instead of disbelief, their laughter filled the air again, but it felt different, sharp and menacing. "It's not a game, Grandma," they said in unison, voices layered with something vile that chilled my very spirit. It was too late, I couldn't escape this. As Claire and Mia exchanged glances filled with acknowledgement, my heart sank. "You made a mistake," Claire said, and I felt my pulse quicken. I thought about the blankets, the love I had poured into those quilts, and it hit me: the offerings they spoke of were not mere children's games, and now I knew I was not just the innocent grandmother in this twisted tale. I had woven my own entrapment with every stitch and thread. I looked into the girl's eyes, shivers racing down my spine, realizing that they had drawn me into their machinations far deeper than I dared to believe, and it was there, nestled inside those blankets, where the true monstrosity lay waiting for the moment they decided to claim it. So, I ask again, AITA for making my lesbian daughter's children blankets? Last Saturday, while the sun cast its late afternoon glow over our modest home, I received a message that would unravel everything I thought was stable in my marriage. It was from Melanie, my husband's ex-wife, and it said she needed a place to crash for a while. My fingers twitched over my phone as I hesitated, recalling the awkward dinners where I plastered a smile on my face while she recounted tales of their life together, stories punctuated with nostalgia that felt like knives twisting in my gut. I caught a glimpse of my husband, Mark, with his dreams of being a father, and I remembered how her shadow loomed over our plans, how he'd sometimes get lost in thoughts of what might have been. I took a deep breath, recalling the bite of jealousy that came with every shared memory, that smirk she wore like a crown, reminding me of her former reign over his heart. I tapped on the screen, whipped it if I told her to find another place. Just as I was about to hit send, I caught sight of Mark returning from the backyard, his hands muddy and a smile on his face, remnants of our future buried just under the surface. There was no response from the group chat, just an empty void of digital uncertainty that gnawed at me. What if they were right? What if I was the villain in this tale? As the day slipped into night, the shadows stretched, morphing and contorting into familiar shapes, weaving my mind into a frenzy of fear and anxiety. I envisioned what my decision could unleash, the ripples echoing into our lives, a thin thread snapping, leaving chaos in its wake. Mark and I sat down to dinner, his friendliness unsettling, and I found myself eating in silence, the tension growing like vines choking a tree. Did he suspect the turmoil I wove inside? My stomach churned at the thought of blurting out my plan. Afterward, as he settled into bed and the house grew quiet, I lay awake, considering every angle until I finally managed to sleep, only to be jarred awake by a crashing noise. My heart raced, I stumbled into the hallway, guided by faint whispers that danced around me. As I approached Mark's study, I saw the door ajar, and the voice that floated through sent chills down my spine. It was Melanie, hushed and conspiratorial, sweet with promises that felt laced with malevolence. I couldn't hear all the words, but the laughter set my blood on fire, and at that moment, the weight of my indecision crystallized into resolve. I would tell her to leave. That night, sleep evaded me as I envisioned the conversation brewing like a storm in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, as Mark sipped his coffee, the sun waking up through the kitchen window, I finally mustered the courage, my blood pounding in my ears. "We need to talk about Melanie," I said, my voice steady but betraying a tremor that he noticed immediately. Mark's eyes narrowed as he pushed the mug away. That was my sign. He listened as I poured out my feelings, how her presence hung over us like a specter, how it embarrassed me, how it twisted the knife deeper every time she smiled at him with that same infuriating warmth. She needs to find her own place, I concluded, my heart racing in my chest as his expression darkened. Silence enveloped the room, thick and suffocating, a pulse of tension twisting like a living thing. "You don't understand how needful her situation is," he countered, his voice soft but full of brooding sadness, leaving me bewildered. How could he still defend her? My heart sank deeper as he went on about her struggles, the difficult life she had because of our divorce, and the children who lived scattered in the wake of their split. Every word he uttered felt like a sharp blade carving deeper into my resolve. I could feel tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I choked back the helplessness clawing at my throat. But as I stared into his eyes, still sparkling with affection, I realized I couldn't let them reignite the embers of their past. The weeks dragged on, the moments we once cherished were tainted by her lingering presence. I could see it in Mark's furtive glances at his phone, the way he wore an anxious smile whenever her name popped up on the screen. It was then I decided that fear alone wouldn't determine my happiness or his instincts. It had to be gone. Our home became a battlefield of unspoken words and invisible corpses, each day a test of my will. I found myself drawn back to the messages, the ones that had painted her darker than before, a sly predator in sheep's clothing. I reached out to friends who had been sympathetic, listening intently while my confidence solidified. They told me what I had known all along. I deserved a life free from haunting pasts, a love untainted by the ghosts of former partners. It was finally time for confrontation. I had nudged the gears forward and couldn't pull back from the momentum charging through my veins. One afternoon, in the midst of kitchen chaos, I called her. My heart raced as the call connected. Her hesitant voice on the other end was a siren's call that needed shattering. "Melanie, we need to talk," I said, every word dripping with resolve, and through the exchanges, I felt the power shift in my grip. She danced around the subject, veering expertly, but I remained anchored, bringing the topic back to her stay. "Mark and I love each other, and you can't keep crashing here," I said, feeling the tremor of adrenaline coursing through my bloodstream. To my surprise, she laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. "You think this is over?" She spoke, silky and twisted. "This isn't your movie, and I'm not going anywhere." I remember that gut-sinking moment when I realized this wasn't merely about space, it was a tug-of-war for dominance. That night, I tried to shake the fear that clenched onto my gut like a vice. I envisioned slamming the door in her face, but it was Mark's words that simmered in my ears. "She's my past," he had told me, like a scar on my soul that can't simply fade. It plagued me every second until the reality set in. I had to act. Just as the sun sank low the following evening, Melanie walked in unannounced. She saw my fury and shrugged like a doll with missing strings. "Can I stay for just one more night?" she crooned, her face plastered with that same smirk that sent nausea churning in my belly. I snapped, my body fueled by primal rage. This was mine, our home. "No. You're done. You've overstayed your welcome," I shouted, my voice breaking the silence with unexpected ferocity. The calmness in her eyes vanished. For a moment, I saw something sinister flash across her face, a sharp edge, a tempest beneath the surface. "You better tread carefully, darling," she hissed, and for an instant, her hand slipped into her pocket, but I stood firm, unwavering. The tension crackled like energy in the air, enveloping us in a precarious standoff. "Get out," I repeated, cold and distant. She regarded me for a moment longer before a slow smile unfurled on her lips that set every hair on my body on edge, the kind of smile that hinted at a deeper madness, a buried threat that rose and fell with every heartbeat. "This isn't over, you know," she said, every word syrupy sweet until she finally turned to leave, and the door slammed shut with an echoing finality. I thought I had won, but as the days turned into weeks, I discovered the true cost of that victory. It wasn't until late one night, sleep evading me again, that I heard the rustling outside our window, so familiar, so haunting. I peered through the blinds, only to find her silhouette lurking across the street, her eyes alight with a dangerous glow. She stood there for hours, unmoving, and in that moment, I felt the walls of my mind closing in. It was then that I realized I hadn't simply pushed her away, I had unleashed a storm far beyond my control. Since that night, my thoughts have been increasingly fractured. Each creak in the house sends my heart racing. I see her lingering everywhere, the grocery store, the park when Mark takes our dog for a walk, even the dinner parties where friends mention her name. I can't shake the feeling that she's watching me, just waiting for the right moment to slip back into our lives like the darkness seeping through the cracks. I wish I could say that I felt free, that I had finally paved a path to happiness, but each day feels like a puzzle piece snapping into place, fraying along the edges. Was I the villain? Did I open a door I was never meant to? The echoes of laughter haunt me in the quiet hours, and as I look into Mark's eyes, I no longer see the warmth I once cherished, all I glimpse is uncertainty. I often wonder if I made a god-awful mistake, and I'm not sure if I can ever escape the shadows she left behind, or worse, if she will eventually come back for what she believes is hers. The claims of an ex haunt me now like whispers in the dark, and for the first time since we said, "I do," I fear I might lose him to her still. When my husband, Mark, met Tyler at the gym, I thought it was harmless. I was glad to see him making a new friend after years of long nights working his sales job. But as their friendship blossomed, spontaneous workouts, late-night phone calls, and weekend outings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become a ghost in my own home, a specter hovering over what used to be our strong family unit, especially as our family tradition of Sunday dinners began to wither like a neglected plant. It felt foreign, like watching someone else take my place at the head of the table where we once laughed and shared stories. I tried to be supportive, reminding him of our Sunday gatherings that had anchored us through both good and bad times, but each time I brought it up, he brushed me off with a half-hearted, "We can do it next week." Weeks turned into months, and soon we were only eating dinner together when he was too tired to go out with Tyler. My frustration turned into resentment. I tried confronting him, but every time I mentioned how much our tradition meant to me, Mark threw in an eye roll as if I were an old-fashioned relic, stuck in a past he had outgrown. The Sundays I had cherished turned into silent nights filled with cold pasta and leftover memories, and though I hoped he would see how much I was suffering, it felt like I was speaking into a void. That's when everything changed. Tyler invited us out to a fancy restaurant downtown, and Mark, without checking with me, enthusiastically accepted, trying to mask the guilt beneath his excitement. I had reached a tipping point by then. The idea of my family tradition being outclassed by what I saw as a fleeting friendship snapped something inside me. I told Mark, absolutely desperate for his attention, that I wanted him to prioritize our family traditions over this new friendship, but instead of seeing my pain, he exploded in frustration, accusing me of being controlling and jealous of his friendships, hurling words like selfish and old-fashioned at me like daggers. On that fateful Sunday, when he chose to go out with Tyler instead of coming home for the traditional meal we'd wrestled to prepare together, I felt an icy grip clench around my heart. Alone in the kitchen, I meticulously set the table for a family that no longer existed in the way I longed for it to. When the clock ticked past the hour we would typically start eating, shadowy memories whipped around me, our kids giggling as they waged food fights, Mark's booming laugh filling the air, the sweet smell of garlic bread wafting through the house as though it were the very essence of our shared life. Then, as if on cue, a knock echoed through the silence, startling me. When I answered, I was met not with Mark and his sly smirk but with Tyler, who wore an expression of shame and good intention that I couldn't quite place. He stood there, holding a large bouquet of lifeless flowers and an empty food container marked takeout. Ty. I felt a rush of emotions crash inside me. Anger, confusion, and a deep sorrow riveted my resolve, but before I could identify one coherent thought, he started to speak. Mark had this at the restaurant, told me he'd be home soon, but... He trailed off, looking remorseful while guilt oozed from his body like sweat after a long workout. And just like that, I realized that I was not just losing Mark but all the warmth the family held had crumbled like decaying leaves. Tyler's voice trembled as he said, he wanted to keep going with our friendship, but I didn't know you were feeling this way when I invited him. With Tyler standing there, I felt every sunbeam of hope vanish, the air thickening with unspoken truths. He didn't even understand. How could he? Mark had grown so entranced by this new life that the shadows of our past had intruded upon my very soul. When I finally raised my voice, I felt emboldened, accusing them both of neglect and disrespect. You think friendship's easy, but family is built on something deeper. It's respect, loyalty, and moments shared over years. You can't just glamorize a flicker and let it drown out a flame, I shouted, voice cracking, losing its strength as Tyler seemed to shrink before me, a boy caught in the crossfire of a battle he never wanted to join. I just wanted him to have fun, he muttered, eyes cast downward. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt a torrent of emotions bubble inside me. Deep down, I knew Tyler was merely a conduit for a chasm that had formed between Mark and me, rooted in neglect and bitterness. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Mark stepped in, laughter echoing against the walls, jangling like bells on a frayed wire. He paused, taking in the sight before him, me, standing defensively, Tyler looking about ready to fold in on himself, and suddenly it struck me that I had become the villain in this narrative. What's going on? Mark asked, the laughter draining from his voice. I stood there, trembling, feeling immeasurable anger but also a pang of desperation as I fought to find the right words. Mark, you're losing us. The syllables formed a shaky confession laden with heartache, and it was as if the room began to tilt, shadows shifting ominously as the truth of my pain spilled out into the open air. In that agonizing moment, vulnerability consumed me, and I saw Mark's face crack open, confusion swirling with realization. Could we claw our way back to the shared memories we used to laugh about like old friends? Could he embrace our tradition instead of dismissing it for something ephemeral? Silence fell heavy between us, and I knew we were all standing precariously on the edge of a broken promise, one thread still connecting us to the flaking facade of our home life, closely adhered to a memory that was slowly being eroded by the tide of indifference. When I married Derek, I knew right from the start that I'd have to navigate the murky waters of his past. After all, his ex-wife, Lisa, hadn't just exited his life like some forgettable chapter. She was a ghost that lingered in every conversation, in the decorations of our shared home that sometimes felt like borrowed nostalgia, and most importantly, in the shadow of her new wife, Anna, who, as odds would have it, turned out to be someone who had an unsettling tendency to insert herself into our lives. It all came to a head one gloomy afternoon in early November, when Derek and I had just settled into our weekend routine of lazy brunch and Netflix. My phone buzzed with a message from Lisa, and I braced myself for the usual pleasantries, some innocent inquiry about the kids, maybe, but as I opened the text, I found Anna's name splattered across the screen. "I heard you don't want to meet me." "That's okay, I understand your feelings." It rattled me, and I tried to shove the inexplicable anxiety down, telling myself it was merely a misguided attempt at something resembling friendship. The truth was, the more I read about Anna, the new wife in a life that should have been severed from Derek but wasn't, the more I could feel the small hairs on the back of my neck prickle, sharper than any ghost's whisper, and it wasn't long before my polite refusals morphed into something darker. I told Derek I didn't want to meet her. He frowned as if he was about to argue, and years of marital negotiations played out in my mind, but thankfully, he kept his mouth shut, a shift I accepted, thinking perhaps he was on my side after all, until one fateful Friday night when the walls felt too thin and the shadows seemed to breathe. I woke in the middle of the night to a banging sound, loud and urgent, enough to rattle the very foundations of our home, but panic surged through me when I realized the noise was coming from the back door, where our kitchen met the dim alley behind our condo. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound, heart hammering in my chest, but just as I reached for the door, a figure darted into the darkness, a fleeting glimpse that caught my breath, Anna, standing there for just a second before vanishing into the abyss, and I swore I could taste her defiance in the air, a bitter tang tinged with a sense of ownership that made me feel as if she was daring me to come out and play. All the warning bells were clanging in my mind. One moment, I felt frozen, and in the next, I was racing back to my bedroom, where Derek slept soundly, blessedly unaware of the chaos of women that seemed determined to ruin our lives. Days passed in a surreal blur, where Anna's shadow loomed larger, and I came to know my own home as a battlefield. I began to hear whispers when no one was around, felt prying eyes watching through curtains when the sun went down, and every so often, I'd catch sight of a figure disappearing into the corner of my vision in the dimly lit spaces of our life. It got to the point of paranoia. I convinced myself Anna was playing some cruel game, trying to push me into a confrontation that, for her, would be thrilling, as if my refusal to engage with her was some sort of challenge she was determined to win. I lashed out at Derek more than ever, accusing him of being too close to his past, a ghost silently haunting our house even during daylight hours. But as it often goes in life, I soon learned that my sleepless nights came at a cost. One rainy afternoon, I received a surprise visit from Derek's sister, Rachel, well-intentioned, but her chatter about family gatherings, during which Anna had been graciously invited, felt sharp, like a knife twisting in my gut. It was on the tip of my tongue to unleash the devils I'd been keeping close, but I bit down murkily, burying my grievances underneath polite smiles, and yet my mind wandered back to Anna, worrying and careful like a spider spinning a web that seemed to ensnare us all in its delicate but unforgiving threads. When I finally reached my breaking point, it was during a dinner party, where the corny ambience of laughter and clinking glasses masked the war raging in my heart. Derek's family, including Lisa, stood in our backyard under twinkling fairy lights, and as if summoned by dark magic, Anna appeared, lovely in an ethereal way that cut into my self-worth like a knife. She greeted everyone breezily, and the taunting gleam in her eyes while she exchanged pleasantries with Derek felt like high stakes. Couldn't they see that she was here to replace me? That I would ultimately become just another piece in a twisted puzzle built on miscommunication and misunderstanding? As I stepped outside, my heart raced cold in my chest. I realized something had to give. In the very first moment I tried to confront her, adrenaline coursing through my veins, things spiraled faster than I could comprehend. "I don't want to talk to you," I asserted a bit too loudly, well aware that the party had all but faded into the background of our confrontation, glances darting between us as if we were the main event. But Anna just laughed lightly, brushing her hair back and holding my gaze with a fierce confidence that knocked wind out of me. "Why do you refuse? You don't have to be so afraid, you know. There's enough room in this life for all of us." Those words hung in the air like a curse, and an inexplicable dread gripped me, transforming my knees into gelatin. My refusal solidified into some sickening reality, that I was terrified, yes, terrified of this woman, this specter of Derek's past and the embodiment of a person who wouldn't just let go. She wanted to stake her claim, and here I was on trial for an invisible crime, sentenced simply for existing next to a ghost. Their laughter felt like a mocking eulogy to a life I had desperately tried to forge, and the air turned thick with tension, so palpable that I could likely cut it with a butcher's knife. It overwhelmed me until the needs for confrontation morphed into something twisted, darker. I wasn't just refusing to meet her, I was staring into a chasm, both terrified and intoxicated by the possibility of falling right in, resisting the call of something sinister I couldn't articulate. And then, just like that, it happened. The lights flickered overhead, plunging us into a surreal dance of shadows before a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated Anna's face, and in that single flicker, her grin twisted into something malicious, the kind that made my heart pound. The conversation fell silent, as if the world could feel the tremor of impending doom, and in that moment, I knew something in me snapped. I couldn't just refuse to acknowledge her anymore. The fear that had been simmering transformed into sheer defiance, something wild and unrestrained. With a smirk, I stepped forward into the abyss, ready to confront the specter that had taken over my life, but the response from Anna was chilling. She took a step back, eyes wide and retreating. It was then I realized I'd become more than just a new player in a game of old lovers. I'd become something darker, something powerful that didn't intend to share. In that strange moment of clarity, with my newfound conviction, I finally understood the horror that wasn't found within Anna's taunts or sneers, but within my own reflection warped within a fragmented mirror of shared pasts and futures. I was battling not just for myself, but for Derek, and the life we had built, and as Anna retreated under the gaze of our onlookers, I couldn't help but wonder, was I really prepared for what I had awakened? What dark consequences awaited us all? The space shimmered with unspoken words and unresolved fears, each person witnessing the birth of a new tension, and amidst it all, that question echoed endlessly in my mind, AITA for refusing to talk to my husband's ex-wife's wife? But truthfully, maybe it was time to discover what lay beneath the surface, to revisit every last secret buried in the darkness that would ultimately either free us or consume us. It was a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, and after hours of cramped leg space and the constant hum of the engines, I was relieved to finally feel the plane start its descent. As we touched down, the anticipation of reuniting with friends for a long-awaited trip filled me with excitement, but that joy quickly dimmed when the plane rolled to a stop and the chaotic symphony of kids crying and parents shushing them erupted around me. Just as I unbuckled my seatbelt, a mother in the row ahead of me started shouting at her child, a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, who had transformed himself into a living tornado of rage and defiance. He was poised to unleash a tantrum that could rival any natural disaster, kicking the seat in front of him with relentless fury, and then it happened. The mother, rather than reassuring him, began to scream, and her voice pierced through the dull noise of the cabin like a siren, as if the whole plane had become a stage for their performance. When the seatbelt sign turned off and the doors opened, I stood up eagerly, ready to move forward, when this little monster darted into the aisle, throwing his arms up and screaming as if he believed he could bring down the whole aircraft with just his cries. Corners of people's faces contorted with annoyance as frazzled parents tried to reason with the child while he stomped his feet, flailing like a banshee. In my peripheral vision, I noticed an older man behind me. He looked ready to snap, his patience already worn thin by the chaotic scene unfolding before us. As he shouted at the kid to stop acting like that and to get out of the way, I felt an unfamiliar pull of anger rise within me, an unyielding impulse ignited by worn-out anxieties of my own. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was standing there, frozen in indecision, 1,000 possibilities passing through my mind. Should I step aside? Should I yell too? But then an audacious thought crossed my mind, why should I? It wasn't my child throwing a fit, and why was the rest of the world suffering under this child's tantrum? As the tantrum escalated, I stood my ground stubbornly. The boy began crying harder, his wails echoing through the cabin as he kicked his little feet against the aisles, making it impossible for anyone to get past. I watched as parents attempted to calm him down, but their efforts were futile. The little boy's pleading screams devolved into a cacophony of noise that seemed to seep into my very bones. I finally whispered, "You've got to be kidding me," under my breath, just as the elderly man behind me shoved my shoulder gently, signaling me to move aside, but instead, I clenched my teeth and grit my teeth, unwilling to give an inch. "Move," he exclaimed, hitching his backpack and glaring at the kid as if he could force him to cooperate through sheer will. It was surreal watching two adults struggle against the manic outbursts of a child, and in a fit of anger, I turned around and snapped at the man to back off, that this had nothing to do with me, and I wouldn't be the one to budge. My voice was louder than I intended, and a wave rippled through the crowd like I had unleashed some invisible force that suddenly everyone had felt. It silenced the room momentarily, and the little boy looked at me wide-eyed, screen-printed with confusion. The mother, no longer raising her voice, stood still with a glazed expression, her hands frozen on either side of her son, the heat of shame and frustration radiating off her. I was taken aback, realizing I was now at the center of this whirlwind, a moment where rage intertwined with guilt as my heart raced in my chest. I felt a sickening mix of satisfaction and regret, unsure if I had escalated the situation or somehow brought relief. I had thought I was being resolute, but instead, I found myself entangled in an emotional disaster. The tension in the cabin thickened, and as the seconds stretched into forever, the boy finally broke. He let out one last defiant scream and surprisingly spun around, sprinting back to his seat, still crying as loud as his lungs could manage, while parents finally scooped their children up and started to clear the aisle, moving around me like I was an immovable object in a world of chaos. But then something terrifying happened. As he settled back into his seat, I suddenly felt a rush of nausea sweep over me, an all too familiar feeling that accompanied moments of pure dread, a thought creeping into my mind that mirrored the chaos. I hadn't just deemed that child a nuisance, had I? I was now a villain in this story, solidified in place and surrounded by sympathetic glares from onlookers who had witnessed my outburst. Words flared hot at the tip of my tongue as I turned to the older man, a stranger who I now saw as a comrade in this blender of emotions. "I'm sorry," I stammered, a futile attempt to mend the invisible rift that had formed, but he laughed, a low, gravely laugh, and nodded, almost approvingly. "You didn't deserve that. No one did. You're not their babysitter," he replied, causing me to feel both relieved and more lost than ever. It dawned on me in that moment, this whole shambolic episode of human suffering was not only about the child, it was about me as well, but the more I dissected it in my head, the more I knew my reaction was rooted in my own tumultuous past. What I thought was just an inane airplane encounter was turning into a dissection of my own character weaknesses. I had endured far worse moments long before needing an emotional outlet against the harrowing memories that had seeped into my mind over time, of feeling trapped, of feeling like I couldn't escape my own emotional dysfunction that had caused echoes of laughter and anger to crumble into one another through time. It wasn't just about parenting, it was about trauma. This innocent child had opened a can that I wasn't ready to confront, and suddenly a flash of clarity struck me like lightning. What if I needed to be shaken for a reason? Luckily, as the line began to move, I found myself taking my first tentative step toward the exit, lingering behind the furious mother and her misbehaving child, drifting just far enough back to feel safe yet still close enough to engage in the raw humanity of what had unfolded. I made it to the door just behind them, and when we finally stepped into the cool air of the terminal, I caught a glimpse of the boy, still ensnared in his mother's frustrated grip. Their dynamic struck me as bittersweet, two broken souls meeting at an intersection of despair. At the last moment, I realized that the world isn't simply black and white. Every outburst is a story, every tantrum wrapped in layers of the unexplained, and in that instant, I forgave us all, even myself, for simply being human. With every part of me still unsettled, I merged back into the flow of travelers, carrying the weight of that awkward confrontation, caught in a web of empathy that lingered in the air, a breath away from devastation and understanding. And as I walked through the throng of people, I hesitated for just a moment to turn back, half expecting to catch the boy's eye, but instead, I found only the fleeting silhouettes of silhouettes blending into the crowd of hurried passengers, their lives intersecting through the storm, never to meet again. Every Thanksgiving, I felt obligated to attend my aunt's annual dinner, a tradition that started before I was even born, but this year felt different, almost oppressive. It was a routine gathering embellished with family feuds and stories of past mischief, but a thick air of something ominous clung to the dining room. As we sat down, the scent of roasted turkey mingled with something disconcertingly sour, a smell I could not quite place. My eyes landed on the side dish Aunt Helen had brought, a massive casserole of what she called Thanksgiving surprise. Something about its texture, the way it glistened under the dining room lights, made my stomach churn. It looked almost like it had been reheated, the edges crisped just enough to hint it might have spent more than a few days in her fridge, or maybe worse, her basement. It wouldn't be the first time I had suspicions about Aunt Helen's cooking. Last year, I remembered swallowing dry turkey while she told me about her magic spice she sprinkled in everything, but nothing that magical came to mind when I examined her last-minute concoction. She caught me looking, her eyes narrowing, and suddenly a wave of guilt washed over me. "You're not going to try my special dish?" she asked. The way she said it felt almost like a challenge, and I felt trapped in the moment, everyone staring expectantly, utensils poised, ready to dive into their plates like eager wolves. I hesitated, a million thoughts colliding in my mind, the family outcast for not trying Aunt Helen's cooking versus potential illness. Instead of answering, I politely said, "I'm full." My lie hung in the air like the sweet potato casserole quietly baking in the oven, and for a moment, you could feel a collective shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of bonds that were already fraying, an unseen weight pressing down on us all. Aunt Helen laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It echoed strangely in the room, tinged with something unsettling. "Oh, sweetie, there's always room for family," she insisted as she scooped a heaping spoonful onto my plate anyway. I could feel my face flush, the need to say no battled by the pressure of familial obligation. My heart raced as I pushed the plate away, a plea to my mom for help dancing in my eyes. She merely shrugged, seemingly lost in her own food coma, and Aunt Helen's vibe shifted to something predatory. I was suddenly acutely aware that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cooking, the dish itself looking far too stale, too out of place, and an echo of horror rose up within me. She had a reputation for experimenting, especially with her more unconventional recipes. Trusting my instincts, I politely declined once more, repeating my mantra about being full, yet Aunt Helen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "You know you can't not eat it. It's special, like our family." A chill ran down my spine, a clear implication that unwillingness wasn't merely an option. My plate, sitting there, so innocently menacing, suddenly became a focal point of dread, and I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, their longing to see tradition upheld clashing with my rising panic. The moment stretched on indefinitely, Aunt Helen's expression morphing from a faux sweet smile to something that sent a tremor through my spirit, a frown laced with unyielding expectation and a hint of malice. Somewhere deep inside, I felt her frustration swirling like a storm, and I suddenly remembered stories, whispers, that Aunt Helen had experimented with unusual ingredients before, substances that could only be described as unique, maybe even dangerous. In a moment of clarity, I could imagine the casserole magically becoming the centerpiece of her questionable culinary adventures. Perhaps she had unearthed a recipe passed down through the generations, one made with something far too bizarre to be served at a standard family gathering. My stomach turned again as the fear bubbled over. I couldn't shake the image of her examining her creation in her dimly lit kitchen, the sounds of her cackling laughter dancing with the phantom memories of the dishes I had once consumed, turning sour and abandoned long before Thanksgiving. The tension broke only when my cousin Joey made a joke that landed flat, but the deflection only caused Aunt Helen to fissure. The silence grew loud and thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions until she snapped, "You'll eat it. It's not Thanksgiving without my special dish." With each insistence, I could feel the pull of tradition choking me like a stranglehold, gnawing at my resolve, pipes of familial loyalty clinging to me as if refusing to let go. I felt the eyes of relatives proclaiming judgment, silently questioning if I would survive another year without indulging Aunt Helen's craving for pressuring me to devour it. One bite, I convinced myself, just one. Finally, I mustered some courage, my hand trembling as it reached for the serving spoon, and then I froze, caught mid-movement, my imagination racing ahead, scripting the silent horror play of what could happen if I surrendered. For what if the dish was made of despair? What if I, too, fell prey to the ancient recipe, consumed by whatever vile secrets lay within? "Aunt Helen, I just can't," I finally stammered, glimpsing the anger surging in her eyes before I reluctantly blurted out the truths I had bottled up. "I can't eat things that have been sitting around. What if it's bad?" The room went deathly quiet, tension crackling like electric current. Aunt Helen's face morphed from frustration to an eerie calm, a chilling smile stretching across her features. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, and I think I detected a touch of satisfaction beneath that sugar-coated voice. "You have no idea what's good for you, do you? This recipe is an heirloom passed down through generations, a commitment of love and sacrifice." In my gut, dread swirled with pure terror as the world fell away, Aunt Helen morphing into an almost fiendish apparition desperate for me to partake in her eerie legacy. The air surrounded me felt apparent with sinister undertone, and every muscle in my body screamed to get away from that table as I heard the whispers of cousins muttering behind me, "Are you really going to challenge her? Family comes first." Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights flickered, and a horrible realization washed over me. They all seemed to be bound to this sick ritual, a cycle fueled by hidden secrets and untold sacrifices. Then Aunt Helen continued, her voice low and almost seductive, "You think we're all just here for the food, don't you? But it's the dish that binds us, keeps our family together through everything, including those who, let's say, didn't make it to the end of the feast last year." A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and a sickening clarity washed over me, a dark understanding fretting at my sanity as I envisioned an empty chair at the table, last year's dinner where a cousin had simply vanished. Was it possible that something more sinister was cooking beneath that surface? The thought propelled me to my feet, my stomach rebelling against me in scathing protest. "I can't," I screeched, the words pouring out of me like molten lava. "I refuse." I bolted for the door as Aunt Helen's chilling laughter echoed behind me, a sound I was convinced would haunt me forever. I rushed outside, my breath leaving me in sharp gasps and my mind racing, picturing the plate of Thanksgiving surprise, the voiceless screams it held, the lingering stench of something rotten that tainted not just the casserole but maybe everything about our family. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back, couldn't be ensnared in whatever dark web Aunt Helen had woven, and I'd sooner fast until Christmas than find out just how far she would go to preserve her twisted legacy. I stumbled into the night, knowing I would be the family outcast in their eyes, but anything was better than feasting on the horrors of last year. As the darkness closed in around me, a thrill of freedom coursed through my veins, and yet, a lingering question remained: would I be the one uninvited next year, or would the casserole have its appetite satisfied before another Thanksgiving crept upon us? When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex, and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo?" she said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. "You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear," she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal. Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love. I never thought I'd be the one to ruin the holidays, but I guess that's what happens when your family decides you're the villain. It all started when Mom began to forget things, small things at first, like where she placed her knitting needles, but soon it escalated to missing important appointments and repeating stories just minutes apart. By the time the doctors finally agreed it was Alzheimer's, we were already deep into the annual holiday preparations, every single corner of the house smelling like cinnamon and pine, a stark contrast to the dread that settled in my stomach. My siblings and I had been discussing Mom's care for months, but every time we brought it up, Dad would brush us off, insisting she was just going through a phase. So, there we stood at the kitchen table that year, stuffing our faces with sugar cookies, debating the reality in front of us while Dad played Christmas music a little too loud to ignore the seriousness of the conversation. We finally decided it was time to take action. My sister and I felt like we had no choice but to push Dad to consider a long-term care facility, a decision that would forever alter the dynamics of our family. After weeks of pushing and arguing, we managed to find a place, one that seemed warm and welcoming, tucked away near a lovely, serene park. I'll never forget the look on Mom's face the day I took her there. It was a mix of confusion and unease, like she was suddenly stuck in a world unfamiliar to her. Sure, there were moments that broke my heart, when I heard her mumble under her breath about wanting to go home, or the way her hands trembled as she reached out for mine while we were walking through the facility's garden. Still, I convinced myself that it was the best decision for her. I didn't realize how my family would react until the holidays arrived. We gathered around the dinner table, laughter bouncing off the walls like the spirited carols playing in the background, but every joke fell flat when someone brought up Mom being in the facility. The looks exchanged, disapproving, hurt, cut deeper than any knife could. "You had to put her in there, huh?" My brother scoffed, mimicking the tone of someone relaying gossip, making a joke out of something that felt raw and broken. I asked him how he thought we could keep up with her needs when we could barely manage our own lives, and in response, he slammed his fist on the table, sending a glass of wine flying off the edge for it to shatter against the floor, the sound echoing in my ears like a tolling bell. Christmas night turned into a disaster. Dad left the table early, mumbling something about being sick, and my brother followed him, grumbling about how things used to be. My sister sat there, seemingly unaffected, but I could see the tears threatening to spill. I felt like I had placed a rift in our family's foundation, and it was my fault. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the remnants of that holiday meal, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. It was surreal watching myself shift from a devoted daughter into some distorted version attacking her own flesh and blood. That's when I heard it, soft, muffled whispers drifting from the living room where my family was gathered. Curiosity piqued, I leaned against the wall, straining to hear their words as well as the melancholy sound of the music filtering through the air. "I miss Mom, she was the glue," my sister said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't the way it's supposed to be." I stood frozen, panic swelling inside until I couldn't suppress it any longer. I was about to turn away when I heard my brother's voice, low and menacing, cutting through the sorrow. "She wrecked Christmas. We'll never forgive her." His words stung, and the darkness began to swell, an ugly, gnawing sensation crawling along my spine. For weeks after, all I heard from my siblings were passive-aggressive remarks about how I was to blame. They'd thrown holiday gatherings minus me, told stories that excluded any mention of Mom's current state, effectively rewriting history to make it look as though I wasn't even a part of this family anymore. I could have handled that, dealt with their hostility, but what I couldn't prepare for was that one icy January night a blizzard hit, forcing them to call me. Mom had fallen and needed to be rushed to the hospital. I couldn't breathe as I drove through the blinding snow, my heart racing faster than my car skidding across the icy roads. Arriving at the hospital, I was met with a wall of tension. My brother stood at the entrance, shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding any eye contact, while my sister's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, the stress and guilt weighing down on all of us. When the doctor finally emerged with a grim expression, it became painfully clear, I'd made the worst decision of my life. Mom had pneumonia. The long-term care facility had been negligent, failing to monitor her properly, allowing her state to worsen while we sat at home, too caught up in our family drama to notice. Standing in the stark waiting room, all the blame came crashing down on me like an avalanche. I was the villain in this warped version of our holiday story, and now, I held the key to her life in my hands. Days stretched into an eternity, and every minute was filled with tension. My siblings and I watched her fight for breath, whispering stories of how she used to bake cornbread on chilly afternoons or read us bedtime stories until we nodded off, hoping that somehow reaching into a happy past might bring back the woman we loved. Then, in a moment that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, her eyes opened briefly, and for a fleeting second, I swear I saw the spark of recognition, a glimmer of the warm, loving Mom I had known slowly fading. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, her breath becoming shallow as our family crumbled around her. A few weeks later, Mom was discharged, but she was not the same, lost in a fog of confusion and fear, like a wisp of smoke dissolving into the air. We decided to take her home, feeling that maybe familiarity would assist her recovery. As we settled into a grim routine, the guilt twisted deeper, roughening our laughter, suffocating our joy, and turning family moments into reminders of what we lost that fateful day I made an impossible choice. If anything good emerged from our turmoil, it was that my siblings and I finally united under an unspoken oath to never let the past repeat itself. We'd always check in on one another, foregoing the blame and the name-calling in the spirit of family. Yet the shadow of that holiday still hung over me, unrelenting and bitter, a chilling reminder of how a seemingly small decision, placing my mom in a facility, had led to our family's unraveling. We may not fully understand our roles in the eulogy of what once was, but I know one thing for certain: the holidays became unbearable, each year a haunting reminder of lost moments, with our lingering guilt festering into a dangerous concoction of shared grief and blame that can either bind us together or tear us apart all over again. So now, as I sit here, secretly shaking and desperately holding on to the hope that we can find a way back to some semblance of love and happiness, I question, am I the asshole for wanting to reclaim my family during this holiday season, or am I just a prisoner to my own mistakes, forever banished from the warmth that was once our reality? I never thought I'd have to justify teaching my daughter the importance of sleep, but the day I found myself sprawled across the living room floor, heart racing and eyes wide open, was when I realized everyone views the world through their own lens, even my 8-year-old. It started innocently enough. Mia was a bright, curious kid who preferred late-night readathons over the weaknesses of sleep. She'd marathon Magic Tree House stories until the early morning hours, and it didn't help that her school started later in the day. I was worried, of course, but I never thought her nightly habit could twist into something darker until I started seeing the whispered shadows creeping around our home late at night, at first, mere figments of my imagination, a trick of the moonlight. But soon, I began to hear them too, soft whispers in the dark, grating against my sanity like nails on a chalkboard. They'd slither around my ears and seep into my dreams, taunting me with secrets that rattled my bones. I tried talking to Mia about how her late-night escapades were weaving a web of sleeplessness, but how could I compete with the enchanting stories she conjured in her imagination? One evening, desperate for a solution, I devised a plan. I would create a reward system for her to go to bed on time, embellishing it with the promise of being more energized and focused during the day. I thought I had struck gold when she eagerly agreed, all while those shadows shrieked in amusement, relishing in my naivete. The first few nights were a struggle as Mia cried for her books, but eventually, she started accepting her new bedtime. It all peaked when I noticed the whispers still darting around me, telling me it was too late to reverse everything, that maybe I should let her stay awake so they could find her, an absurd thought that sent a wave of anxiety crashing over me. One night, the tension reached its breaking point. I had just finished reading to her instead of the usual bedtime story. It was a thrilling old fairy tale, a diversion from my own creeping dread, almost lulling me into a trance as I tucked her in. But as I did, I saw the shadows cast onto her wall, impossibly long and grotesque, almost resembling hands trying to grab her. It was ridiculous, terrifying even, yet mesmerizing. My heart pounded in rhythm to the whispers, the urgency palpable in the air. She must stay awake, join us, they seemed to chant. I flipped on the nightlight, banishing the darkness to its corners, and she squeaked out a frightened "Daddy, are they coming for me?" My laughter cut through the air, a desperate attempt to cloak what I felt was creeping closer, but there was no hiding my terror from her wide, unsettling eyes. I spent the night monitoring her, a pit of dread building as I realized the whispers had become frantic, feverishly relentless, urging me to let my daughter know she was safe, but I felt increasingly uncertain of my own sanity. That was my breaking point, and in an act of desperation, I whisked her away and enrolled her in a sleep training program I had read about online. They said it would teach her both the importance of sleep and ensure restful nights. But the horrified look in Mia's eyes, begging me not to leave her during our first session, tore me apart. Yet I pressed on, my mind firmly convinced it was for her own good, for a small sense of normalcy. Sessions churned into weeks, and while Mia took her lessons to heart, I was left spiraling deeper into sleepless desperation. Each night felt longer, and the whispers invested more time in raking my mind over the coals of dread. She doesn't need you, she'll choose to join us soon. It haunted my dreams, transforming her laughter into disturbing echoes as I tossed and turned in worry. I desperately reached out to other parents, but in our social media group, my pleas were met with laughter. "Come on, it's just sleep. You are not being called to join the Sandman," they chuckled, but each laugh cut deeper until their amusement morphed into derision. Before long, they had tagged me as the overprotective dad who couldn't let go, further isolating me. I deployed strategies I'd learned in my own sleep-deprived state, led by what they advised rather than what felt right. I pushed her limits, enforced rules, and even barricaded her bedroom door with pillows, a move that causes waves of shame to ripple through me now. That night, the shadows slipped under her door, engulfing my household, murmuring vehemently, and I swear I could see them reaching for her. Tina, my wife, had long since given up. To her, Mia's sleep rebellion had graduated into another anecdote from a baffling father. I could hear her whisper late at night, "You're being overbearing," but every absence of sleep kept straining at my desperation. One fateful evening, the whispers crescendoed, echoing through the walls, and in a moment of sheer terror, I rushed into Mia's bedroom. The room was dim, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon spilling through her window, and there was Mia, soundlessly sleeping, but the voices screamed louder, almost erupting from the very corners of the room. She must choose, she must choose. In an act of panic and fear, I picked her up, shaking her awake, shouted for her to get up. "It's important she stays alert," but my wide-eyed daughter crumpled in protest, her face stricken with fear. I was thrust into the horror unfolding before me. The shadows coiled tighter around me as I cradled her, horrified at how they began to flicker in the corner of my vision. They wanted her. In an all-consuming frenzy, I dropped her back on her bed and slammed the door shut, gasping for breath as if I had disrupted an ancient ritual. Had I doomed us both? The next morning was met with a silence that pinched my conscience, and when I approached Mia's room, I found it empty. My heart plummeted, 1,000 terrified thoughts racing through my mind. I dashed through the house, frantically searching, but the only noise that greeted me was the echo of my breath against the walls. It was then that I remembered the voices saying they would wait. Her door creaked open, and I felt their presence encircle me, still lingering like an unshakable chill. I tore back to where the shadows had taken me, and my hands fumbled to pull open the old closet door, revealing only impenetrable darkness, and there was Mia, but caught in a trance, a pitiful expression on her face. I would pay any price to pull her from that abyss, back into my arms where she belonged. When she returned to me moments later, her eyes focused once more, I held back my tears. It was all my fault. I had taken away the only shield she had against the shadows, her bedtime stories that filled our lives with imagination and warmth. As I cradled her, I made a decision. I would let her have her stories once more, even if it meant I could never truly sleep again. The importance of sleep suddenly became the echoes that trailed behind us, a gentle reminder of what dreams truly held. Though I still yearn for quiet nights, I realized the cost of my lessons was far too high. Am I the jerk for trying to teach my daughter the importance of sleep, or have I simply opened a door I can never close again? When my friend Sarah made the comment about my girlfriend Lisa being the token Asian, I felt the air grow thick with tension, as if someone had just whispered dark secrets in a crowded room, every eye quickly averting to look anywhere but at me. We were at a bar, surrounded by laughter and chatter, the kind of casual Friday night that usually brought the best out of people, but suddenly I felt like I was trapped in a scene of a horror movie where something sinister lurked just beneath the surface. I glanced at Lisa, who had been animatedly discussing her passion for pottery before Sarah's comments disrupted her flow, and her smile faded, replaced by a mask of confusion and hurt that twisted my stomach into knots. It was as if a storm had swept through, leaving only the debris of my friend's thoughtlessness behind, and I could sense anger rising in me, a primal reaction against the ignorance that seemed to lace Sarah's words. "What the hell did you just say?" I shot back, my voice a little louder than I intended, drawing the attention of nearby patrons who peered up from their drinks, eyes wide as they waited for the unfolding drama. The uncomfortable silence that enveloped our table felt electric, but I refused to let Sarah dismiss this as a joke, a little quip in what was supposed to be a friendly gathering. "You can't just say those things," I continued, heart pounding, the heat of embarrassment and rage pulsing through me, imagining Lisa's discomfort as if it were my own, the disbelief on her face cutting me deeper than any knife. Sarah's face turned a shade of red that echoed the shame she clearly wasn't feeling as she sputtered out a defense that made the situation worse, insisting she was just being funny and that I was overreacting. I thought about how Lisa had shared stories of her battles against subtle racism and microaggressions, the times she'd struggled to be seen as more than just a stereotype, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about a careless remark, it was about the ways society reduced people to labels and jokes that cut deeper than anyone could imagine. A palpable tension hung thick between us, as Sarah's entourage murmured awkwardly, clearly caught between wanting to support her and acknowledging that what she said was deeply out of line. I turned to Lisa, who was now looking down at her untouched drink, the smile that used to brighten her face replaced by an expression of disappointment, making my heart ache for her, wishing I could shield her from the ignorance I deemed unworthy of a real friend. When I shot Sarah a glare that must have conveyed 1,000 unsaid words, I noticed a flicker of realization cross her face, perhaps a brief moment where she understood the gravity of her insensitivity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. In a desperate attempt to reclaim the joviality of the evening, she tried to laugh it off, cracking a joke that fell flat in the thick air between us, but I could see the hints of defensiveness edging back into her demeanor, and I realized that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a window into the fractures of our friendship laid bare, like a raw wound festering under the guise of normalcy. I didn't want to confront her pride at the expense of my relationship with Lisa, but I couldn't sit there and pretend it didn't happen either. The evening curled into a ball of chaos, laughter replaced by awkward shifting in seats, as everyone seemed to tiptoe around me and Lisa, waiting for fallout that hung over us like dark clouds. I remember feeling the flame of anger cool slightly, churning into something deeper, a fierce protective instinct taking root in my chest, compelling me to stand up for Lisa not just because she was my girlfriend, but because she deserved to exist in a world that appreciated her complexity, her beauty, her cultural identity, rather than dismissing her as a punchline. It's not a joke if it hurts someone else, I finally said, my voice softening but laced with steel, drawing Lisa's eyes toward mine, and in that pregnant silence, I watched as a shared understanding dawned on her face, a flicker of gratitude that made all the chaos worthwhile. Sarah huffed, her demeanor shifting from defensive to wounded, and I caught sight of tears brimming at the edges of her eyes, but I wasn't here to soothe her guilt, I was here to advocate for the woman I loved, and that was my priority until my last breath. The confrontation caught everyone off guard, turning their drinks into props in a tragic play unfolding right before them, and I thought about how desperately we cling to the comfort of ignorance, how the need to be liked sometimes makes us forget our humanity. The conversation wended onward, but it was clear that something had shifted irreparably. We finished our drinks and left, Lisa and I walking in silence through the night air that felt heavier than it had moments ago, but also liberating, as if in confronting the harsh absurdities of our reality, we unearthed a bond far deeper than I had imagined we were capable of sharing. As we reached the car, I could sense a beautiful understanding forging between us, and I dared to hope it might be a step towards healing the bruises that had marked both our hearts and our interactions in a world where sometimes, standing up means stepping away from the toxic comfort of friendship for the sake of love. I'm writing this because I'm overwhelmed and terrified, and honestly, I don't know who to turn to because the whole thing feels surreal, like something out of a nightmare, and if I don't get it out there, I feel like I might explode. It started when I got engaged to my longtime boyfriend, Mike, and decided to have a small wedding in the woods near our favorite hike, nature-themed, simple, and intimate with just a handful of close friends and family for a lovely, rustic gathering. We were excited about everything, but when it came to the cake, we decided to go vegan since my best friend, Kylie, is vegan and had been there for me through thick and thin. We wanted everyone to enjoy it equally, without feeling pressured, and there's this small bakery that makes the most decadent vegan cakes, chocolate with raspberry filling, my absolute favorite. They assured me that the texture was just as rich as a traditional cake, and honestly, I was all in, so I ordered it and kept the choice a secret, wanting to surprise everyone. The day of the wedding arrived, and the air was crisp, filled with the sweet aroma of pine and flowers. The sound of laughter and soft music floated in the breeze as we exchanged our vows, surrounded by the natural beauty that had brought us together. The cake was everything I hoped it would be, a centerpiece topped with wildflowers, and everyone marveled at it when it was revealed, but as soon as someone took a bite, an odd heaviness fell over the gathering. The look on Uncle Barry's face was a mix of confusion and horror as he wiped remnants of cake from his mouth. A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, and before I knew it, Kylie was storming up to me with a scowl that could peel paint. Apparently, during her speech about happiness and acceptance, she inadvertently revealed the cake's vegan nature, which catapulted the guests into what felt like a modern-day witch trial. Barry, arms flailing, demanding to know why I had tricked him into eating something I hadn't labeled properly. It all spiraled out of control. Suddenly, guests were accusing me, some saying they felt disrespected by the deception, while others stood up for me, defending the choice and emphasizing taste over labels. I felt trapped in the eye of a storm, where accusations and judgments collided like thunder. I tried to explain my intentions, how I wanted to bring everyone together, but the more I spoke, the angrier they became, some claiming that it's unethical not to make dietary choices clear, which I didn't think was fair when at every event, there's bound to be someone who doesn't agree with the choices made. The tension was suffocating, and soon, guests began to leave one by one. I could see the disappointment written on my mother's face. She'd put everything into making this day special, but all I felt was shame invading my mind. I desperately sought out Mike, who was trying to calm Barry down in a corner, their voices rising with each heated word. Finally, unable to hold back anymore, I turned to Barry and said I was sorry but that he was being dramatic. That apparently triggered the lid off a boiling pot. Somehow, the conversation shifted, and not only was I under fire for the cake, but the whole wedding became a mess that solely fell on my shoulders, with even my mom chiming in with her disappointment. People began packing up the gifts, and I couldn't even process what was happening. Instead, I felt trapped in an absolute nightmare, and I began to weep while holding the remains of the cake, its beauty now marred by a strange mix of frosting and guilt. I lost track of time as people slipped away into the waning light, their murmured judgments still echoing in my head, and I could scarcely absorb the fact that my wedding day had transformed into a circus of accusations over a slice of cake. I caught snippets of conversations as the last of the guests trickled out, and someone even suggested that I should have known better than to force a cake with false marketing on them. I truly hadn't meant to upset anyone. How could a cake embody so much hostility? That night, Mike and I headed back home, his mood reflecting the dimness in my heart. He offered me a half-hearted consolation, mentioning how everyone was being overly dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow ruined our biggest day over something that should have brought joy. Scrolling mindlessly through my phone later, I stumbled upon posts on social media clarifying their positions on veganism as if it were a debate about morality. It tore at my heart when I discovered pictures of my wedding cake, captioned with anger, disillusion, and disbelief from guests recounting the horror of being tricked. That night, I had dreams of each guest's scornful face as they took their first bite, transformed into grotesque figures, shouting that I had robbed them of their right to true desserts. I woke up drenched in sweat, barely able to stomach breakfast, each glance in the mirror reminding me of the shame that lingered so heavy on my conscience. It's been weeks since the wedding, and things slowly returned to normal, but I haven't spoken to Kylie since. She messaged me once to say she felt embarrassed, but I didn't respond, the disappointment in her voice too much for my heart to bear. From my peripheral, I've sensed Barry lurking online, recounting the wedding misstep in forums, initiating dialogues about what it means to purposefully hide vegan options, while I sit here haunted by memories of a beautiful day turned sour over a cake. I wondered if it was worth it to stand up for my decision or if they were right, and the guilt eats me alive. So, am I the asshole for refusing to label my wedding cake as vegan? I just wanted to create a joyful memory, and instead, it feels like I've broken an invisible contract of trust over something intended to be delicious and inclusive, and I can't shake the horrible feeling that whatever small sliver of pride I had in my choice has suddenly turned into something heavy, dark, and deeply harmful.